Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stoliarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our U.S. Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. Today is Sunday, January 25th, 2026, and this is actually our last salon of January, so time flies quickly. But we are pleased to continue a conversation that was just so fascinating in September of this year during our Virtual Enlightenment Salon with Stefan Lorenz Sorgner that we believed it was important to bring him back. So joining us is our panel of U.S. Transhumanist Party officers and members, including our Director of Visual Art, Art Ramon Garcia, our 2020 U.S. presidential candidate and Director of Marketing, Charlie Kam, and our 2021 endorsed candidate for mayor for the city of Camden, New Jersey, Jennifer Hughes. Also, hopefully soon, our friend Alan Crowley will join us. He heads the Transhumanist Party of Texas. So we have a distinguished panel to speak with our guest, Professor Stefan Lorenz Sorgner, who is a world-leading philosopher, renowned for his work in posthumanism, transhumanism, Nietzsche, and the philosophy of music. He is especially known for his interpretations of Friedrich Nietzsche and his critical engagement with human enhancement and emerging technologies. He is a philosophy professor at John Cabot University in Rome, director and co-founder of the Beyond Humanism Network, and a fellow and advisor of numerous organizations, as well as the editor-in-chief and founding editor of the Journal of Posthuman Studies. He is a prolific public speaker. He travels widely, and he has been so gracious to join us for a continuation of the extensive discussion we had in September. I will also point out he's the author of numerous books on philosophy, including Metaphysics Without Truth, on transhumanism, We Have Always Been Cyborgs, The Philosophy of Posthuman Art, and coming this year, Euro-Transhumanism. The book Euro-Transhumanism is going to be released in late May of this year, but you can pre-order it now. Here is the website for it from Bristol University Press. And this is just an impressive book for its scope. I'm going to show you the table of contents of this book. It's easiest to just see it on the screen. You can see here 24 chapters. He goes into politics, religion, morality, education, art, personal matters, broader cultural, societal matters. All of this is within the purview of this philosophical framework of Euro-Transhumanism. So it is quite a comprehensive read, and I would encourage any of you who are interested in going into the ideas we discussed today in greater detail to pre-order the book. So with that being said, I wanted to mention where our conversation last time left off before turning it over to Stefan. So in the last approximately 10 minutes of our previous Virtual Enlightenment Salon, which again you can see here, we ventured into the subject of political polarization and how that has been intensifying in the Western world. And it seems that the conventional sides of the political spectrum, the MAGA right and the cancel culture left, are seeing past one another and are both subject to some of the same fundamental flaws in their thinking, which actually reinforces that deadlock between them. And Stefan was discussing the essentialist mindsets that exist on both sides of this divide. Stefan is a critic of essentialism, and he began his critique previously, but unfortunately we ran out of time. So this is why I invited him back, because I think it's important to further explore that critique and how Euro-Transhumanism might be able to offer an alternative, because really any sort of alternative that presents itself right now is at least worthy of serious consideration to enable us to transcend the polarization, which is getting worse. If you look at the news in the United States, especially, just every single day you see another egregious act or egregious development. A person lost his life unjustly in Minneapolis just a few days ago, and we want to reach a world where that stops. So how can it stop? And Stefan, I know this is quite a tall order to pose that kind of inquiry, but I think you're one of the best people to address this kind of dilemma. So please tell us about the book. Tell us about your thoughts. The floor is yours.
Many thanks for that extremely kind introduction and really for that excellent summary concerning the debate we've had during our last meeting. And yes, I do want to continue exactly where we stopped, because I think sort of I gave the example of, or started to deal with the example of Woody Allen and sexuality. And I think this is exactly where many of the central aspects of the cultural wars actually focus on. And whenever such issues get addressed, it can be certain one is not making oneself a lot of friends, or it always brings about heated debates. But the issue is really, and the issue is essentialism. The problem is that the people, all the intellectuals sort of claim that universal validity for their own approach, claim what I think is universally valid. And I think sort of this claim for truth is the fundamental challenge, which we all need to address. And a non-essentialist transhumanism, the Euro-transhumanism, can better address than the other alternatives, and thereby, of course, it loses its ground. It's like it becomes a castle made of sand, because in the end it renders clearly that it itself is something which necessarily has to vanish again, and it acknowledges this. It doesn't claim for universal validity. This is what anti-essentialism, this is what non-essentialism actually demands. And so, yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts and your responses to my suggestions. And I want to highlight all the things I'm presenting are suggestions, are reflections. They're not they don't claim to be universally valid, but they're like, my as good as it gets answers and judgments to the great variety of challenges we're facing with. And I want to focus on, because that's where we start, and I think this is sort of a focal point of many of the culture wars. I want to focus on the case of sex. Many thinkers, from Plato over Lucretius to Schopenhauer and Freud, have highlighted the fundamental relevance of the sex drive. Implicitly, its central importance has also been acknowledged by fundamentalist religious traditions. And due to its power, their focus has been on chastity. Women who take the vows of chastity become the pride of Christ and the Catholic tradition, which also gets symbolized by the veil and the ring. And the Orthodox tradition nuns merely receive a veil. If you're not strong enough to fully dedicate yourself to God, you may live sexuality in a natural union between a man and a woman, whereby the natural order of the world always ought to get considered. The aim of the eye is to see. The aim of the nose is to smell, and the aim of the genitals is to reproduce. If you masturbate or use contraceptives, then you use the genitals in a non-natural manner. And this is still a very strong part in many discussions, also whenever naturalism, when sort of this is unnatural comes up. And that has a lot of implications concerning many transhumanist stances. In critical posthumanism, so critical posthumanism is sort of a very extreme, is a leftist approach, which is very critical also of liberal democracies, which is very strong in many, in particular in universities. In critical posthumanism and transhumanism, the natural law of the world gets dissolved, at least in most aspects of transhumanism. However, this occurs in different directions. In critical posthumanism, the binary ontological conception of the world, which can be traced at least to Plato's allegory of the cave, is the root of the challenge, as there the binary power structures of discrimination originated. Because there was like whiteness and blackness, racism, there was rational and the emotional, which is sexism. It can be traced sort of to rationality being the human, and the non-human, the non-rational, the speciesism. And all of that can be traced to the allegory of the cave. The central goal of critical posthumanism is to culturally move away from these binaries. However, it's far from easy to do so, as a binary way of conceptualizing the world is deeply ingrained in our language too. So hence the importance of revising words and their use within, this critical posthumanism. Transhumanism increases insofar as it also conceptualizes the world as extremely dynamic, and this also means that who we are as human beings is subject to modification. Critical posthumanists are more cautious in this respect because they always highlight the capitalist forces which enable such modification procedures. Hence, they regard the financial interest of companies who realize the technologies as problematic, as well as the ideals which are often aspired for due to them being propagated in social media, whereby traditional power structures get duplicated. Due to our complex entanglement in the world, critical posthumanists do not affirm the notion of autonomy, which on the other hand is strongly affirmed within transhumanism. Even though it's uncertain whether it's kind of an ontological grounding, whether we actually whether we possess the capacity of autonomy. Most would say, while ontologically the concept of autonomy is implausible, this doesn't apply to the normative concept of autonomy. If critical posthumanists draw upon the notion of autonomy, then they have at the most a relational autonomy in mind, which implies that vulnerability, relational care, and resisting dominations get prioritized over the concept of autonomy. So autonomy matters for these approaches, but it's always one sort of vulnerability and relational care are more important even than the autonomy, or need to be prioritized. It also needs to be mentioned that there are different versions of course, of transhumanism, that there are significantly different interpretations concerning autonomy within these alternative versions of transhumanism. And I already mentioned 4 different approaches in the first discussion. Autonomy plays a central role in transhumanism as it unfolds itself in different versions of negative freedom, morphological freedom, educative freedom, reproductive freedom, and many other types of freedom. While critical posthumanism stresses that everything is culture and hence based on some human interests, transhumanism highlights the relevance of evolution, whereby dominance, reproduction, and health become particularly important. And I do want to highlight that because this actually does and must be considered also when it comes to issues concerning sex. Which of these elements is central strongly depends on the respective transhumanist tradition which gets considered, as it's essential to highlight that there's a great variety of different transhumanist approaches. Due to the relevance of morphological freedom in transhumanism and the focus on a non-binary account of relational care within critical posthumanism, both of these cultural traditions are moving away from the traditional binary account of sexuality, so from the conservative, fundamentalist, religious approach concerning sexuality. Transhumanists merely highlight that sexuality has to involve competent adults autonomously consenting to being involved. This not only applies to a heterosexual relationship, but also includes same-sex, queer, non-binary, or transgender relationships. Critical posthumanists share these concerns. However, they also highlight the relevance of vulnerability, relational care, and resisting domination. And these elements actually become dominant when it comes to critical posthumanism. Hence, these demands significantly move beyond the norms of transhumanism, as here the need of undoing hierarchies becomes central. Even though both cultural movements move away from the traditional Judeo-Christian sexual ideals, they affirm different rationalities when it comes to appropriate ways of sexually bonds. So I'm talking about the morality here of sexuality. While transhumanism primarily highlights the relevance of consent among competent adults, critical posthumanists stress care and the attempt to undermine structures of abuse, which for them is related to problematic versions of power dynamics, which has significant practical implications. And the following three challenges are particularly relevant. Critiques of sexual power dynamics is fundamental in critical posthumanism. It can unfold itself in various ways. Firstly, if there's a significant age gap between the partners, then critical posthumanists highlight the vulnerability of the younger person. Transhumanists focus on the issue of consent, self-determination, and the non-harm principle, and stress the power is perspectival, whereby it becomes unclear who is in control. Thus, it might well be that the older person is more vulnerable. Given the power is perspectival, no general statements are plausible. What is the decisive criterion of power? And this insight is central for Euro-Transhumanism. Symmetry is important when it comes to sexual relationships. However, it needs to consider the perspectival judgments concerning power of everyone involved. And this is the decisive factor. Applying generally valid criteria of power, as is being done by critical posthumanists, is implausible due to power being perspectival, according to Euro-Transhumanism. Secondly, if there's a financial inequality in a sexual relationship, then financial dependency, coercion, and commodification need to be considered, according to critical posthumanism. A lot more could be said concerning all these elements, and their critiques of commodification might be particularly influential as it applies to reproductive economies, prostitution, sex bots, as well as porn economies. Transhumanism, on the other hand, does not necessarily have a strong stance on all these issues as long as only consenting adults are involved, at least concerning most forms of transhumanism. And transhumanists usually highlight that financial power differences are secondary as long as no manipulation is applied. Voluntary consent is the gold standard. It is central for transhumanism to take evolution seriously. That's a different element. Evolutionary psychologists have analyzed in detail what counts as attractive from an evolutionary perspective. Nancy Etkoff, and she's a very fascinating evolutionary psychologist from Harvard University. She was a former wife of Steven Pinker. She wrote the monograph Survival of the Prettiest, The Science of Beauty. It highlights that the evolutionary standpoint implies that young women, actually stresses sort of 18, 19, count as most beautiful for most men, whereas bodily beauty is secondary for most women from this perspective, and elements like trust, reliability, power, and being able to be a provider count as attractive. And given these insights, a certain financial inequality might even be advisable for a successful relationship. However, the following insights must not be forgotten. Symmetry ought to be important when it comes to sexual relationships. However, it needs to consider the perspectival judgments concerning the power of everyone involved. In order to avoid getting hurt, as entering into a sexual relationship makes everyone involved vulnerable, trust is relevant in a sexual relationship. When it comes to a heterosexual bond, a woman has to accept three significant risks, whose relevance have an evolutionary foundation. Trust is essential for her as she wagers the seed, the sickness, and the story that may follow. The risk of pregnancy, as preventative measures can always fail. The risk of a disease, so it's important to know and to trust one's partner sufficiently that he's behaved accordingly in the past, then it's possible to believe that what he says. Too many cases where even they have an STD and they don't even inform the partner about it. The risk of humiliation to avoid being placed in an uncomfortable public situation, for example, social media. Power games are central in the storytelling of our lives. Even though it seems to be a widely shared element, it remains an open question whether it applies to all cultures. An additional factor which further underlines the relevance of trust is safety. Safety can have to do with being safe from physical violence, economic, emotional, and future-related challenges. Safety is not reducible to seed, sickness, and story. Safety is rather foundational, a meta condition, or maybe even a precondition for all these three other elements of trust. As safety is only partially dependent of seed, sickness, and story. Seed can be related to the safety when surrendering bodily autonomy. Sickness can be connected to the safety concerning one's health. Story is closely connected to the safety concerning the protection of someone's cultural identity. For man, the risk of pregnancy and humiliation are more limited. A man can be made to pay for the offspring, a man can be made fun of. The risk of a disease, however, is fundamentally relevant too. Hence, the issue of trust is also central for man, and truthfulness, openness, and self-care are virtues which are relevant for most people involved in a heterosexual sexual relationship. And not only that. Even though different criteria apply for men and women in this case, all parties involved are vulnerable, and their vulnerability depends on many different factors. However, Etkoff strongly relies on the traditional categories of biological sex. Within transhumanism, there's a wide range of different approaches. Some would merely highlight that voluntary autonomous consent among competent adults is decisive. Sexual attraction might merely come down to an exciting entanglement of the people involved. Etkoff considers survival and sexual selection as evolutionary perspectives. Nevertheless, the relevance of social distinction can also be an outgrowth of the evolutionary process, whereby cultural elements become more and more important, which Etkoff acknowledges but doesn't focus on. Hence, there's also Martin Rossblatt's transhumanism, which highlights that there are as many sexual identities as there are people. I agree. What matters is autonomous consent among competent adults. And this applies to all kinds of sexual relationships, for example, heterosexual, same-sex, queer, non-binary, or transgender relationships, even though any categorization can already be seen as overtly reductive, because any generalization depends on sort of the cultural framing, on some categories which were invented. And this is the understanding which is also central for Euro-Transhumanism. What matters for this version of transhumanism is the autonomous consent among competent adults. Asexuality, too, is an option which can be related to social distinction. In this case, a person prefers to abstain from any kind of sexual bonds, while focusing on other goals in the life world. Survival of the fittest, sexual selection, social distinction represent three dimensions of evolution. And we need to take, we are part of the earth. So we need to take the evolutionary factors into consideration. And the element of survival is central for all living beings. And here the relevance of safety comes in. Sexual selection takes a reproductive element into consideration, even though we're moving into a direction into which reproductive technologies seem to replace sexual reproduction. So the new technologies become more and more important when it comes to reproduction, and sexuality becomes different functions. Here, the reflections on heterosexual relationships come into play, even though it needs to be highlighted and kept in mind that any kind of sexual categorization needs to be overly reductive. Besides safety, the element of trust is central, which also applies to any kind of sexual relationship. However, here an additional factor needs to be considered, which particularly applies to those who affirm a traditional heterosexual framing. And I'm mentioning that because it's still sort of, it applies to the majority of human beings. Trust is essential for her as she wages to see the sickness and the story that may follow, whereas for him, the element of sickness might be more relevant than the other two dimensions. And this asymmetry does not mean that symmetry is not important. Nevertheless, besides the perspectival evaluations of power, additional evolutionary factors concerning sexual selection become relevant. To stress this element does not mean that any kind of biological essentialism gets upheld. Not at all. This is not the case. It implies, however, that the evolutionary element concerning sexual selection must not be disregarded either. And the evolutionary element, is usually more ingrained into one's psychophysiology than the cultural framings. But both of them are in the end, contingent elements and subject to change. Finally, there's the element of social distinction, which stresses that there are as many sexual identities as there are people. In the end, it's the element which is decisive for Euro-Transhumanism. Autonomous consent among competent persons is the most relevant factor when it comes to sexual relationships. And this should be central in the case of heterosexual, same-sex, queer, non-binary, or transgender relationships. Here too, it needs to be kept in mind that any type of categorization is already bound to be reductive. The person is a unique bundle of elements whereby any kind of categorization has to include overly reductive elements. A flourishing sexual relationship demands some kind of symmetry between the persons with their unique sexual identities. Whether symmetry is present does not depend on generally applicable criteria, but on the perspectival judgments concerning power of everyone involved. And this is where traditional approaches, essentialist approaches, have gone terribly wrong. Survival, Schopenhauer's will to live, sex, Freud's eros, and social distinction, Nietzsche's will to power, represent facets of evolutionary tribes. It depends on the respective accumulation of power interpretation, which of these elements becomes dominant in a specific psychophysiology, according to Euro-Transhumanism. Different persons have significantly different criteria. Even though health is a multi-purpose good, is a widely shared criterion. It is not the only significant feature. Hence, voluntary consent among competent adults is a decisive gold standard for Euro-Transhumanism. The third factor, if there's a significant hierarchy concerning authority, family, institution, celebrity, then the possibility of consent can be undermined according to critical posthumanism. And they stress that consent is not a binary yes or no reply, but it is relational, situated negotiation, which get distorted by a strong hierarchy gap concerning authority. Related challenges clearly come out in the case of the relationship between Woody Allen and Song-Ji Brevin, who used to be the adopted daughter of his then partner Mia Farrow, with whom he was never married. And I'm not discussing the relationship between Allen and Farrow. And this is basically where we stopped the last time. That's why I'm highlighting this element. However, Allen and Farrow were a long-term partnership and they had children together. There's an age gap between Allen and Brevin of about 35 years. Secondly, there has been a family type of entanglement between Allen and Brevin, as Allen had a quasi-parental role in the household, even though he was not her adoptive father. Third, there was a strong authority gap between Allen and Brevin, as Allen was a global celebrity, rich and with an enormous amount of cultural capital, whereas Brevin was a first-year university student when they came together. Given the enormous asymmetry between Allen and Brevin concerning age, family structure, and authority, the possibility of a genuine reciprocal care-based relationship, as well as the possibility of an authentic consenting yes by Brevin, gets undermined according to critical posthumanism. And that's a widely shared attitude, even in societies nowadays. And that's why Allen got canceled. On the other hand, it needs to be noted that their sexual relationship began about 35 years ago. They got married in 1997, and they still live together as husband and wife. And this is sort of the best you can hope for. If the evolutionary elements, as described by Nancy Adcoff, get considered, they represent a couple in which each partner had the peak of attractiveness based on evolutionary psychological perspective. So each one of them had the peak of attractiveness when they came together. From Adcoff's perspective as evolutionary psychologist, bodily beauty is important for most men, whereas authority, trust, and stability are strongly valued by most women. It is fundamental for most versions of transhumanism to seriously consider the implications and relevance of evolutionary theories. In contrast to Adcoff's understanding of evolution, which primarily focuses on survival and sexual selection, other transhumanists like Euro-Transhumanism also highlight the element of social distinction as outgrowth of the evolutionary perspective. In this case, the gold standard of a sexual bond is whether some kind of symmetry between the persons with a unique sexual identities is given. And this can even be the case when a seemingly enormous asymmetry concerning age, family structure, and authority is present, as was the case with Woody Allen and Song-Ji Brevin. It needs to be kept in mind that it depends on the perspectival judgments concerning the power of everyone involved, whether asymmetry is present or not in generally applicable criteria. I'm coming to my concluding remarks. It should not be much of a big surprise to highlight the sex drive is fundamentally important for human beings. Hence, it has become an intensely discussed cultural battlefield on how to deal with sex in the appropriate manner, on the morality. I was not talking about, primarily talking about, what leads to the good life. I was just talking about the morality here. Traditional conservative perspectives still play an important role in the discussions today. In the sense sort of Judeo-Christian tradition, with all of their essentialisms which go along with it, and I briefly summarized them at the beginning. Critical posthumanism and its ancestors have done an excellent job in highlighting the paternalistic structure of fundamentalist approaches, because the fundamentalist approaches with an essentialist claim were like, man, rationality being superior, emotionality being inferior, and all, and they strongly take the position of the so-called of the weaker part. Most transhumanist approaches, on the other hand, defend cancel culture against their fundamentalist critics and stress the relevance of uncanceling cancel culture, which goes along with paternalistic approaches. So, they all, most transhumanists in that, they no longer share such an essentialist understanding as there was in the Judeo-Christian tradition. But at the same time, it has also become clear that by highlighting the relevance of vulnerability, relational care, and resisting domination, at the most, a relational autonomy might get upheld by critical posthumanists. And this leads to strongly paternalistic elements. And they've really gone over the board with many of these claims. Thus, cancel culture, which is closely entangled with critical posthumanism, has become enormously influential at universities. Thereby, excessive versions of cancel culture have become dominant in certain intellectual circles, which cancel people like Woody Allen, who, at least in the case mentioned previously, has done nothing morally problematic from the perspective of Euro-Transhumanism. They're two competent adults making a decision, and you really turn the first-year student into someone immature if you claim, you know better than them what is in their interest. So hence, uncanceling cancel culture also implies that excessive versions of cancel culture need to be criticized. So uncanceling cancel culture means, on the one hand, there is something, criticizing all the essentialist elements which go along with the traditional monotheistic religion. That's a very strong stance, because there's a lot of violence connected with it. On the other hand, then by going into the other extreme, by suddenly saying, no, if you praise any type of standard, your traditional relation, more traditional bonds, then that's already morally problematic. And by basically demanding that someone who's, their clear standards, who is the weaker part, and then whenever sort of a relationship occurs between someone who they regard as a weaker part, then it also becomes immoral. That is as paternalistic and as dangerous as basically the traditional religious fundamentalist. So because they also claim they've got an essentialized criteria of what is the morally right one. So it used to be, if we talk about art, it used to be beauty. Now beauty goes along with violence, and so now it needs to be monsters. But both are basically fundamentalist, essentialist approaches, which go along with a lot of violence in what they affirm. So, thus the term uncanceling cancel culture is meant to be ambiguous. This is why it's both a defense of cancel culture against its fundamentalist critics, those who want to return to traditional, traditional religiosity, as well as a critique of cancel culture in excessive forms, which basically affirms, no, unless you affirm sort of the ideals upheld here, you're immoral. That's another type of essentialism. It needs to be highlighted that transhumanism is divided on the issues raised here. On the one hand, there are various transhumanist approaches which uphold the relevance of consent among competent adults, as described previously, for example, Martin Rothblatt or Euro-Transhumanism. On the other hand, it must also be noted there is one version of transhumanism which embraces a more conservative stance concerning sexuality, and which, due to its enormous relevance in the tech business world, can be referred to as classic transhumanism, which Elon Musk being one of the main representatives. And the conservatism of classic transhumanism gets revealed by Elon Musk, for example, not being supportive of his trans daughter, which while he's praised the extremely conservative advocate Charlie Kirk, who was recently murdered. So that goes more along with the sort of fascination of a more essentialist understanding, basically, of sexuality. And with the approach, which the approach I'm trying to highlight here, with the Euro-Transhumanist approach, it does acknowledge there are some asymmetries between men and women, and it makes sense to talk about men and women, even though of course words are just metaphors, are just contingent categories which we humans have created, but most people do associate with them. So by highlighting that it's just a metaphor, but a metaphor which usually works because these are the dominant criteria in the life world, this is a way to acknowledging the impact, basically, of many types of traditional essentialisms. But at the other hand, in the end, they are just evolutionary factors, and they are widely shared in our psychophysiologies. But this doesn't mean that they're essential and universally valid, because there's another dimension, and that's the cultural outgrowths. And for many, actually, the cultural outgrowths is more important than sort of what is evolutionary ingrained. And sort of the outgrowths is the sexual identity which people form. And there's there are as many, in the end, there are as many sexual identities as there are person in the world. And in the end, what we really need to focus on is sort of trying to avoid the violence which goes along with the essentialism, and that leads to the binary distinction. But otherwise, we can allow the great plurality of different types of flourishing by realizing, well, we need to decide at a certain type what the decisions people make. We need to acknowledge them. We need to acknowledge that they are mature, and they have got the right to making the decision, whether they are actually not mature or whatever. And then you bring a story that's extremely paternalistic to doing so, because you claim to know better than what other people, then you could claim to know better than others what is in their interest. But this is, of course, you have just been talking about the morality. It's a completely different issue. What actually sort of, if anything, can be said about sort of something personal fulfillment or the good life, eudaimonia, no? And here in the end, sort of the classic transhumanists actually do have a different approach to what I'm highlighting. In classic transhumanism, much more, they embrace a much more base hedonism. David Pierce, for example, a base hedonism, which also comes out. I also embrace a type of hedonism, but it's a more refined hedonism. I wouldn't say, the base hedonism, which goes, and that is being shared in many of the pop-up city I talked about before. It is about sort of the area being you've got workshops on tantra, sex with changing partners, or you've got workshops on polyamory, and sort of it goes more along with whatever matters is embrace sexuality, embrace a biased kind of hedonism, And I think sort of I would personally stress, but that is a different issue, as I said. We've got our roots, we've got our biological roots, and we need to acknowledge them. And health plays an important role. So I would be extremely hesitant. But all of these statements these are suggestions I'm making. I was trying to say, what are the dangers related to the essentialism, which is such strong players in the case of cancel culture, and which we can find both in traditional religious approaches, Judeo-Christian tradition, as well as in such perspectives where, if we take seriously what Elon Musk said in classic transhumanism. But in the same way, it is as bad, basically, in the case of the extremely left critical post-humanist approaches, which is a dominant in universities, which highlight now, unless you subscribe to that understanding of vulnerability and care, that becomes important. And we decide then in the end what is an appropriate relationship. And I think we need to take seriously what an adult person actually, which decision they need to make about their lives. And this is basically, many thanks for your attention. I'm looking forward now to having further exchanges on these really pressing issues, because they really go further. In the end, it's about understanding of nature. When we talk about morphological freedom, should I have the right to use specific technologies? Do others people know better than you which technologies to draw upon? Should we have a clear structure of enhancement, getting better? There are specific goals which need to be aspired for. So I was just highlighting one specific factor, but it's at the heart of many of the challenges which transhumanism is facing. So looking forward to hearing your thoughts on these issues.
Yes, thank you very much, Stefan, for that nuanced overview and analysis. I think it would be best to start out with some viewer questions on some of the more basic concepts, and we can develop the discussion further from there. So David Wallace Croft wonders, what is essentialism? So for those of our viewers who haven't encountered that term, Stefan, could you explain it and the core of your critique of essentialism?
Yes, thank you. Wonderful question. No, it's really so. Essentialism is a claim that there are universal, fundamental, unchanging truths about the world, and sort of one of the maybe a philosophical way to describing sort of the challenges related to what essentialism is basically, many of these types can be traced to the allegory of the cave as it comes up in Plato's Republic. So in Plato's Republic, there's a world which we access by our senses. We all live in this world. We see the empirical world all around us. But by thinking, we can actually move outside of the cave. By using rationality, we can move outside of the cave and we reach the form of the good, the idea of the good. But that we can only do so by our immaterial mind, according to Plato, by using rationality. And so we've got a distinction on the one hand concerning the world of change which we live in and which we access by means of our senses, and a world which we can only access by means of our mind, by our immaterial mind. It is no longer part of the material world. And that is rationality. And that leads us to the idea of the good, which is supposed to inform us about what the essence of the good life is for everyone. And basically, one of the criticisms highlighted here is basically, in Plato, that was associated with the sun. The sun is bright. And then we are all sitting in the cave, and the cave is dark, is black. And so according to the criticism and this interpretation, which highlights also that, Christianity is Platonism for the people, it stresses, well, sort of here the binary distinction, which says, whiteness is superior, white supremacy, and blackness is inferior. This is the roots of racism, is basically already part of that Western tradition, which can be traced to Plato and then is taken over in the Judeo-Christian tradition. And it goes further because we access this rationality by means of our the essentials, by means of our essential rationality, and the rationality is something culturally identified then with the male. Whereas sitting in the cave, it's sort of emotionality, not being rational, and that's culturally associated with the female. Then again, the criticism goes sort of this essentialist understanding of the world that in essence is our rationality. We men are absolutely essentially superior to women, and sort of it's a fundamental structure which is related to sexism. And the third step could be, or is, that sort of rationality is a typical human characteristic, whereas animals are defined as being non-rational in Cicero and many others. That's a traditional definition of a way to explain rationality, the implication of rationality. So it's the essence of humans who are to be superior to the rest of all natural entities. And that's where speciesism comes from. So speciesism is basically like racism and sexism. It's a morally illegitimate structure which claims the infinite superiority, the essential superiority of humans over other species, and so on. But in the end, the problem really is it is a claim of the essential claim of truth. This is valid for us. This is valid for Nero's times. This would have been valid for the Neanderthals. This would have been valid for the beginning, from the Big Bang onwards in all different times. So that's a completely absurd statement, basically. Just the imagination to thinking that there are any type of essentialist truths, claiming, it's something which is beyond evolution. And that's completely, that has dominated Western thinking for many millennia. However, it's a completely absurd thought. So it's absurd, and secondly, it leads to morally illegitimate types of discrimination. And so this is what we've overcome, culturally overcome in the Enlightenment after Darwin and Nietzsche and Freud. And many transhumanists also embrace that, with some exceptions within classic transhumanism, for example. And so the essentialism is really the claim that there is something which is valid outside of time and space for all times. And I'm saying so, but many of these elements, maybe which we, many of the elements actually, there are some elements which are more ingrained than others. And this is where the evolutionary part comes in. But when the evolutionary part comes in, it's still not an essentialist claim, the claims where I talked about asymmetries and so on. It is because it's evolutionary. It changes, and it will change, and we can influence evolution by means of by means of technologies, and that's a great thing. And so that's why most of the transhumanists would say this is a they would affirm a non-essentialist understanding with some exceptions.
Yes, thank you very much, Stefan, for that answer. And David Wallace-Croft also thanks you for the definition. Now, your critique of essentialism seems to be based on the characterization of essentialism within the Platonic framework, so the world of forms that exists outside of this material, ever-changing world that we inhabit, and those forms are purported to be constant for all time, and that's where the essentialist perspective, as you see it, comes from. Now, I'm reminded of this picture. This is the School of Athens, and you can see here the images of Plato and Aristotle, where Plato is pointing upward and Aristotle is kind of gesturing down to the ground, to the material world. And Plato and Aristotle had a huge difference in terms of how they saw essences. So Plato saw the essences as being lodged in these transcendent forms. Aristotle saw essences as being in things themselves. So a chair has within it the essence of a chair, the chairness. And his view of essentialism would be the essences are contained within the beings themselves, the entities themselves. So could that kind of essentialism be more responsive to change as well? Because let's say an essence of a biological being is grounded in the biological nature or in the characteristics that that entity evolved to have, but those characteristics could change as well. And if we change those characteristics through some modifications, be they technological or be they the result of changes to society that perhaps lead to different incentives, lead to different behaviors, could that change the essence too, while keeping some manner of essence, in the sense that as humans change, as the human organism change, we're not going to become rocks or trees, and we wouldn't be well served by behaving like rocks or trees, but we might be better served by behaving differently from how our ancestors behaved. So what would you say in that regard, perhaps a more nuanced essentialism?
Yeah, wonderful question. Yeah, so nuanced essentialism is tricky. Even so, what you described here, I would have to go firstly say, did Aristotle and Plato actually differ? And many would say, no, in the essence, actually, their claims are, maybe even the same, because both Aristotle also claimed, at least concerning theoretical insight, there are some essences, some insights, theoretical insights, which are universally valid. But sort of let me move on without clarifying directly, what did Aristotle actually mean, or how does Aristotle and Plato relate? So what you talked about, um, can we make sense of something like an essence within us? An essence within us which is not immaterial. So if it was immaterial, if it was something unchanging, then it would be nothing, it would be really just the same as a Platonic idea. So that's not really interesting. This goes along with all the problematic types of discrimination and so on, and even insights, implausible insights, which I've already mentioned. What about if they're in within us? And if they're within us, what is there anything in our bodies which doesn't change? Most parts of our bodies, our cells are in the permanent process of change, at least, 10, 11 years. Besides our, there are some, the neurons. The neurons are actually quite stable. But even the neurons as such, we can actually generate neurons when we're getting older. They can get added and they can create it and they get integrated into our brain. So even the neurons are not something we can get created as well. What about the genes, the genetic structure as part of our body? Well, even as part of our epigenetic interactions with the environment, we can turn genes on and we can turn turns off, and how they relate to each other actually can be altered during the process of a lifetime. So even here, these things might be they are more stable, and I do acknowledge that, but they are still in the process of change, and they can be changed. So they can be changed as a consequence of environmental interactions, of things which happen to us, intensive ultraviolet rays, or even nutrition, but even intensive experiences we have can bring about epigenetic changes. In the same way, so they come from outside, but now by means of CRISPR-Cas9 and gene drives, it is possible to actually create these things ourselves. And this is why I don't like to talk about essences within us, because everything which is actually a part of our body in principle is contingent, is subject to change. I mean, there are some things which are more difficult to change than other things, than sort of the cultural elements. And sort of concerning the cultural elements, I want to highlight sort of, let's say, 70 years ago, it was widely acknowledged, homosexuality was, crime still according to many constitutions. Now, 70 years later, we've got marriage for all and even further claims. So culturally, these things can change enormously fast. Um, However, parts of our body, they don't change so fast. So that's why I think sort of the evolutionary heritage, and that's why I also stress some of the insights concerning evolutionary psychology, they are more firmly ingrained in parts of our psychophysiological structures, but that doesn't mean they're essences, because even they can be altered by means of psychotherapies, by means of genetic or even chemical interventions. And so that's why I hesitate. I find the use of essences within us really misleading, because they seem to apply, or they seem to have the connotations of there was still like an immaterial personality which we have, which we cannot change, just like a Platonic idea. And that's why there are levels of encrustedness. Some are more firmly encrusted than others, but in the end, all the structures within us are contingent, and that's why I don't like to talk about essences within us.
Mhm. Yes, thank you for that explanation and clarification. So you would reject the idea of any unchanging essence. Would you say there are some objective qualities, at least at any given time, which would, let's say, suggest or even necessitate certain courses of action as being better or worse? Say, if we're biological entities right now, maybe we won't be in 1,000 years, but if we are right now, then eating food is objectively good for us. Eating poison is not objectively good for us. It will harm us, maybe kill us. If in 1,000 years we come to have, say, cybernetic bodies and really durable ones, then perhaps the same poison that would kill a biological organism today would not kill that body, it would have no effect on that body. But at any given point in time, would there still be objective ways to consider what is good for an entity and what is not good for an entity?
Great question. So again, the question is here you're using the term objective, and I don't think any even scientific insights are objective. But that doesn't mean, of course, I trust scientific insights. There, for example, in scientific insights, for example, are the result we can reproduce scientific experiments, and the more often something gets reproduced, the more reliable it seems to be. But all swans seem to be like, and then suddenly a black swan comes up, and then we need to integrate that into our theory. That's a problem of induction. That's a problem of any scientific theory. The future might not be as it was in the past. So that's why I sort of hesitate to use the term objective in these contexts. I said some are more stable, some are better founded, some are more reliable. Even the person. So I don't want to sound too postmodern if I say everything is just contingent as a matter of increment. In the end, I do subscribe to that understanding, but that doesn't mean I doubt the validity of science. Of course, anyone who stresses the relevance of interpretation and the relevance of things being contingent, and who gets on board of the plane, would commit a performative self-contradiction. If you only go on a fly with a plane, because it's reliable, because chances are very good that you arrive safely where you want to fly to. And why? That's because scientific insights mean something. They are valid. They're valid. They're not objective, but within the context, within our framing, they usually work. Once we move to Mars, once we move to a different planet, we might have to adapt some of our insights. They might no longer work. Maybe even here on Earth, given different specific changes occur, they might no longer work. That's why I'm not using the term objective in the sense, because it doesn't lead to that, but it doesn't lead to that universal validity. But they're valid. They are empirical truths. They are scientific truths. And I strongly, hold on to scientific truths. Whatever we find out by means of the natural sciences clearly is a scientific truth. A scientific truth is different from a philosophical truth, which claims objectivity and universal validity. But within the framing of the thing we take, of course, these things work, and we can rely upon them. And I love these scientific insights. And so again, that's why I'm hesitant of saying I wouldn't use the term objective. I would only use the term objective if there was really some traditional Judeo-Christian Platonic framing where you have something actually exist and it can never not exist. However, so there are different levels of security we can rely on, and scientific truths are a wonderful insight. And the same applies. I mean, and some of these insights might have a relevance concerning how we act. And that's why I was highlighting evolutionary psychology. There are some emotional responses concerning others, which are the result of our evolutionary heritage. And that's what I read. So Nancy Atkoff has done an amazing study. I mean, I really strongly want to highlight that book. For example, how we respond to beauty. And sort of she's drawn upon on a lot of different experiments all over the world in different cultures, and she basically found, oh no, evolution and the responses to beauty and so on, they come up in different parts of the world. And so, for example, she studied the relationship of parents to children. And so she didn't mention the psychologists who made the experiments. They didn't mention what they investigate. They just looked and studied how closely, how intimately, how longly parents hold their kids in their arms, hold their children in their arms. And what the study basically showed was, well, if the child is beautiful, the parents, in all cases, parents usually take care and love and support their children. But if a child is beautiful, the more beautiful a child is, then parents love to caress, love to actually hold their child longer in their arms than when the child is ugly. And basically, sort of the notion of beauty and ugliness here really refer to some traditional notions like symmetry, the golden mean, harmony, these things. And and I wouldn't claim symmetry, harmony, and the golden mean, for example, they're universally valid, as it was claimed, for example, in the medieval and the Platonic tradition. However, they are related. They are related to basically health factors. They are related to evolutionary factors. And we cherish health. We cherish health enormously. And that's why it can be found that's why such responses to beauty have actually become a firm part of our psychophysiological constitution. And you can sing a very tonal song to young children at the age of 5, and you can do that in Botswana, in India, or in Italy, and the response is always the same. Some certain tonal harmonies, harmonious relationship songs, the children love that. And then you confront the same kind of children. Then you confront the same children with Schoenberg or Stockhausen and some radical avant-garde music, and they will hate it. They don't relate to it. Does that mean that harmony is valid or is universally valid? That's an objective insight. Of course, it doesn't mean that. It just means that we need to take evolutionary factors into consideration. And the evolutionary factor is here, which comes into play, that sort of harmony, symmetry, golden mean. These are elements which have traditionally been associated with something like health. And from an evolutionary perspective, health plays an enormously important role for us human beings. And health is something, and this again has also been studied by evolutionary psychologists. They found out, and there was a study in the United States, for example, which basically asked people if they are 120 years old and were completely healthy. Would you want to keep on living? Do you want to have an expanded health span if you're 120? And the response was about 80% of the population said, yes, we want to do so. And that completely makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. Does it mean that being healthy is some moral obligation? No, it doesn't mean that. But it makes sense for most people that for most people, health is important, and that's why it should matter politically as well. For example, that's why the regulation in the United States that there is no universal healthcare system is really a terrible decision, and that's why the life expectancy, and that has consequences for the people in the United States, where people live like 4 or 5 years less than they do in the European Union, where basically they do have a universal healthcare system. But you see, I just want to stress, no, look at the evolutionary factor. Thereby, we do not get necessary insight. We do not get objectivity, but we get empirical insights which need to be taken into consideration, also concerning the issue of sex.
Yes, thank you very much, Stefan, for that clarification. So it seems that you do think there are courses of action or properties that have actual validity, but it's a contextual validity. It's not universally and immutably the case always in all contexts across time. It's dependent on the context, but it is very real within that context.
Exactly, absolutely. But at the same time, by acknowledging that, it also means, no, in principle, if we've got a certain genetic condition, it's that's a contingent hypothesis about us. We are works in progress. We can, if we realize, we've got a reliable way of making us living, having a 20 years increased health span, and someone wants to live, and most people want to live longer healthily, then we should actually, it's advisable for most people to do so. It really makes sense. And there's no natural union. There's no natural order, which basically should force them to actually, to remain unchanged. There is no necessary objective demand, the natural order. We shouldn't do so. God has created in that specific manner. And it's God's gift, and we shouldn't remove God's gift. No, these are possibilities. They're currently the situation, we can probably live at the most 122 years. But if we can change that, and if you want to do that, and we can change everything, and that is sort of the fascinating insight. Everything, really everything, is contingent. Everything is subject to change. Some things are more difficult to change than others, but this is a strong move away from basically this traditional insight, which has dominated centuries, which has dominated millennia. There's a world order which is natural, which you shouldn't change. And that's where, so the evolutionary factor plays a role, but on the other hand, the cultural factor also plays a role. And this is where morphological freedom comes in, and sort of the cultural self-determination. If there are people, and there were people in the UK who said, look, I don't see myself as healthy. My left leg is healthy, it's fully healthy, it's functional. And but I personally don't like my left leg. I don't see myself as having a left leg. I don't need a health insurance to pay for me. I don't need any handy support from social securities later on in my life. I'm financially stable. I can take care of all of that myself. I want to help, but I hate my left leg. I want to have my left leg removed. Then the person should have the right to have their left leg removed. If someone's willing to perform the surgery. But there's no natural order which says, look, the person is ill, or is handy, is the person is mentally ill, needs some psychotherapy. No, that's why it's sort of, on the one hand, traditionally we might cherish, evolutionary factor. It might not be helpful, to remove your left leg. And that will surely be a thought which that person has had too. But concerning the cultural framing, the cultural self-understanding that person has, the person sees themselves as someone without that left leg, and they are not a burden to anyone. So why shouldn't they have the right to remove their healthy left leg? And this is sort of where this understanding, it removes a lot of even the criteria for a functional definition of health, for a functional definition of what is a healthy, a strong, a flourishing human beings. And that's why I'm so hesitant concerning a lot of the uses of enhancement, in the same way as I'm hesitant concerning the criticism of critical posthumanists concerning vulnerability, because in the end, many of the and what counts as enhancement, there's not the universal criteria of what counts. In the end, it comes down to the individual, and that's why I'm particularly cherishing the notion of morphological freedom, and that persons should have the right to embrace their own understanding, and as long as they don't harm another person, and fully live on the basis of these decisions without any external infringement.
Yes, thank you for your answer, Stefan. And of course, morphological freedom is a strongly held value among transhumanists. And in the United States Transhumanist Party, we have Section 6 of our platform, which does speak to morphological freedom. It states the United States Transhumanist Party upholds morphological freedom, the right to do with one's physical attributes or intelligence whatever one wants, so long as it does not directly harm others. And then we set forth a variety of examples of what constitutes morphological freedom, including, for instance, setting forth provisions for how one would be handled if one were to enter into a vegetative or unconscious or similarly inactive state, including, for instance, the freedom of a cryonics patient to choose to be cryopreserved, even if the legal and cultural norms of a society say that that person is dead. That person should still have the right to direct in advance that this cryopreservation procedure be undertaken, and others should not be able to veto that, whether those be, say, governmental bodies or family members. A person should have that right. So this is one area in which we do agree. Now, one difference or perhaps nuance would be if somebody tried to amputate a healthy left leg and they weren't trying to replace it with a super functional prosthetic leg, then I would, if I were in a position to communicate with that person, try to inform that person, well, look, you are going to lose a lot of functionality by doing this, and I know that you think you can compensate for it, but your life would be easier in practice if you had your left leg, at least until you can replace it with a functional robotic prosthetic if you really don't like the biological left leg. And I wouldn't say it should be illegal for someone to do this. I wouldn't say coercion should be applied to prevent someone from doing this. But I would say there are wiser and less wise courses of action. Just
But
like,
would you do that? Would you say that to anyone? Or would you only say that to people who are your friends, who are near and dear to you?
well, I mean, I could say this to anybody who is in a position to hear me publicly right now. If you're thinking of amputating your left leg and you don't have anything better to replace it with, I would recommend that you not do that. So even if you're not my friend, even if you're my enemy and I dislike you, I would still recommend, and I would think that it is better for you if you had two functional legs, whatever the composition of those legs, or more than one functional leg. If you want to have 3 or 5 or 12 eventually, that's your choice. But don't get rid of functionality. That's my
Would you do the
position.
same with someone who wants to have who's transgender, who wants to have their sexual organs altered? Because then it becomes from a functional sexual organs to becoming a dysfunctional sexual organ. Isn't that the same thing?
Well, in that case, I would say, and I've said this before, and we did have a salon where we discussed transgender and trans identity issues. So think about what is really important for your flourishing, and that includes any physical implications thereof. So I think you made that point too, that there's a wide range of sexual identities and manifestations. And for some people, they might not have certain desires that other people do, or they might have those desires that manifest differently. So, from my standpoint, I would say think about what you really want as an individual and what would improve your quality of life in such a manner that you will not regret later on. So, this is where, for instance, the US Transhumanist Party definitely supports this kind of morphological freedom, the right of people to modify their gender, undergo any sorts of surgeries or procedures if they're older than the age of consent. So in
Of course.
contemporary Western
Um,
societies, this is after the age of 18. But the reason why we wouldn't support it for children, in large part, is because children don't yet know fully what they want. They haven't yet fully developed the faculty to know. So there is, in my view, a large risk that they might choose to regret whatever procedure they decided to have as children or teenagers. So I would say to any person, think about what you truly want and will find fulfillment in, and make the kind of decision that you will be able to look back on hopefully many years, decades, centuries later and say, yes, this was the right decision. I don't regret it.
but you wouldn't say it's illegal, and we
No.
agree upon that. Would you say it is immoral?
Well, I wouldn't go that far if they're not
Good.
hurting somebody else. I would say it might be, if it's a choice that they made that they regret later on, I would say that's tragic, that's sad, that maybe there could be a different way that they could have acted. But I would say just really think about all the implications of such choices. And the more consequential the choices, the more you should think about the implications, whatever that may be, whether it's with legs or gender changes or any other major life decision.
Absolutely, and I think we're in complete agreement in that respect, because it shouldn't be legal, these choices, and I don't think it's immoral. And concerning the individual decision, there's such a great variety of different concepts of the good. What really corresponds to their tribes, to this bundle of tribes which they themselves are. It is very difficult for a third person to make a judgment concerning what is in their interest. And the decisive factor for such an ethics of autonomy to really get an understanding is that people need to get an understanding what actually is in their interest, without there being any without there being any stable core which corresponds that is actually in the interest, because even the bundle of tribes are permanently changing. So there's no essential core which always corresponds, but there's something which is further ingrained than other things. And that's why we need to train, we need to establish the prerequisites, and that's where the virtues come in. We need to establish certain virtues and promote specific virtues that people realize what is more core, what is more central to their bundle of tribes than other things. And that's why I'm in the Euro-Transhumanism book, I'm highlighting virtues like mindfulness, truthfulness, and self-control. Because all of these three elements are central prerequisites for basically realizing what is more closely in your interest than other things. So with respect to mindfulness, it is you analyze, what there's. It's so easy to get from your peers, from your friends. You move to a different culture, and everyone says, no, you should, have a good time, enjoy your life while you're young, travel from 2 months there, 2 months there, just have a great time. And then, is that really in your interest? Go analyze yourself what you actually want. Or do you have a specific different understanding, what is your goal in life? Do you want to have some stable relationships later on? Isn't that maybe not undermining maybe your relationship later on if you've lived like, in such a loose manner before? Then truthfulness. Truthfulness doesn't mean I get some true understanding about my essence, but I'm actually truthfully analyzing, even though I might not always be happy what I'm finding. I might really get my kicks from stuff which other people find evil, which other people find terrible. As long as you don't harm a third person, then truthfully acknowledge what you long for, your desire for, what your drives are. And the third part is once you've realized, then maybe you still don't stick to what you realize. And that's where the self-control comes in. And we need to strongly promote the capacity of self-control. And that's where also pharmaceutical devices could come in, which increase the likelihood of actually sticking to the values and the norms which you self-subscribe, which we regard as appropriate. And so that's why the virtue education towards these specific virtues is probably more relevant than anything else for actually being able to be in a position to making an autonomous decision. Because the majority of, it is very easy, in particular in a world where you grow up with all the social media, to basically get thoughts installed in your mind which you will regret later on. And that's one of the fears. But I would still, tell them, do go ahead and live that. But I would try to promote, do think about it, do analyze yourself, what is really more fundamental at your core. And that's why I also stress the element of the healthy lack being removed, or the transgender surgery.
Yes, thank you for your answer. And I do think we agree in these regards on the importance of various virtues in making that decision, and on the importance of considering the longer term consequences and what is best, at least to the conception of oneself and one's own flourishing that one would have, which is a longer term conception. It's not just in the moment. And I'd like to reinforce something that you said about essentially having a more nuanced view than just short-term hedonism. And I would actually hope that most transhumanists, however they classify themselves, whether classical transhumanists or just transhumanists without an adjective, wouldn't be in favor of just seeking pleasure for the sake of pleasure. I don't really see that much overlap between transhumanism and the Silicon Valley fads like polyamory. Yes, there might be some people here or there, but I generally see those fads as just being unsustainable. And again, from the standpoint of long-term consideration, where does one want to be, say, within the framework of a relationship many years into the future? That just doesn't work. That just doesn't lead to anything stable or fulfilling in retrospect. And hopefully a lot of people recognize this. A lot of self-identified transhumanists recognize this. There may be just some bubbles in the Bay Area where that's being practiced, but that's
I
just
think
my
it's
perspective.
I so strongly agree with you. I mean, and sort of, but I fear actually from what I've seen, sort of in particular, sort of in the Bay Area tropicals, we're the cool guys. We're living at the edge in the frontier houses. We try out everything and go beyond the core borders, not like all the rest. We travel like nomads all in all different parts of the world, enjoy ourselves, embrace our sexual fulfillment in the different manners without thinking about the implications. And that is a widely shared. In particular, if you travel a lot, if you lose your bases, if you lose your roots, we need to understand the roots are important. And the roots, without, if you cut off your roots, you wither. And I'm not saying we just need to stick to our roots because everything's contingent and can be altered. But there's unfortunately there's been such a tendency of always, in particular with the particular progressive, be the hippies at the time, but many of the Bay Area tech elite also embracing such an extremely naive base hedonist stance, which I find they should live with it if that makes them happy. But I personally doubt. I would tell the stories and say, look, we need to cherish our roots. We need to take care of our evolutionary framing. And here is also there's an asymmetry between men and women, particularly when it comes to the risk of reproduction. We need to cherish our health, our safety, and that is, these are issues with that's why I'm really strongly critical of the base hedonism. Because all of these issues undermine or risk sort of that base. The base hedonism has a risk, is a health risk. I've had people telling me coming from the Bay Area is that like whose partners basically didn't tell them that they've got an STD and they then have consequences for the rest of their lives because you let yourself be engaged with people you don't know. You don't know sufficiently well. You think you might know. That's why sort of trust is such an essential element we need to focus on. And I don't want to sound overly conservative or things. I think, but these are challenge with actually, if you cherish health, if you cherish a long health span, we need to take that into consideration, and we shouldn't think, oh look, we're the technological avant-garde and we break all the rules and we create our own new rules and we create our own contracts in bubbles living together in polyamorous relationships for 2 months here, 3 months there. And that's I've in most cases I've seen sort of people regret if they've done that before. And so this is what but without making the claim, even these insights are not essentialist judgments, internally valid judgment, but they are really a result of taking our evolutionary heritage into consideration, then our biological roots into consideration. And that's why I'm extremely critical of this hedonist Bay Area tech, which is so traveling the world in order to enjoy themselves, take selfies, post them on Instagram, and show how cool and exclusive, what a fun and lifestyle they have. And I'm stressing, no, there's a lot to be gained from a more, from a virtue-based approach, which is a heritage of a lot of European thinkers. That's when I'm talking about Euro-Transhumanism. I don't have a Eurocentric approach. I'm not Europe save the world. But in particular, and also at universities, but be it at universities with a more left critical post-humanist stance, as well as in the tech libertarian tech hedonist world, they both have the understanding. Look, we move away from everything what has been there before. The Bay Area, they move toward the future. And the critical post-humanists basically negate everything which has been traditionally affirmed in the Judeo-Christian tradition. But I think look, and that's why I call it Euro-Transhumanism. There is actually, the white man in Europe doesn't have to be the enemy. The white man in Europe, the philosophers, the intellectual, the poet, the musicians. We've had a long tradition going back to Plato, and I see a lot of challenges in Plato, but there's a lot to be gained from Plato, engaging with Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, Descartes, and Kant, and Nietzsche, Spinoza. There's a lot of relevance for engaging with that tradition. We shouldn't, and that's why I'm sort of hesitant with identifying some classic transhumanism. Look, forget your roots, move to Mars, and forget about the past, forget about virtues, just enjoy yourself and create something completely new. And I said, no, and I don't think you have to be from Europe to embrace Euro-Transhumanism. If you cherish some of these insights, which can be traced to Spinoza or Nietzsche, or Freud, then if it's valuable to take these things into consideration, to take a step forward, then this is elements of a Euro-transhumanist approach without claiming all of these insights have a universal validity. But I think the future needs the past, and we need to embrace. I personally have my roots in the European, cultural tradition. And I don't want to get rid of that. I think it's really important to engage with it, even though I think I want to change the world. I want to use the technologies, live to 150. That's healthily to 150. That's wonderful, but that doesn't mean I would give up these roots. I take care of them. I gradually progress. And it's not that suddenly everything becomes you need to cherish indigenous cultures in Argentina and study them, and all that becomes relevant, or you travel to Thailand and do the things. But no, I cherish my cultural past. I investigate that, and on that basis, I want to develop further. It's more, and I do cherish certain virtues. It's not completely cutting off the roots, but taking it's not even more cautious, but being taking care of my roots in order to develop further, because I know that's part of who I am, and it's important of who I am, and I think actually we can benefit enormously from that tradition too.
Yes, thank you very much, Stefan, for that answer. And I agree with you about the importance of virtues in making the decisions about how one should act. And it's interesting, we have a comment from our friend John H. More Life, Please. He says he would be okay with hedonism if it were even a possible state of affairs. He thinks it's a self-limiting dynamic because of hedonic set points and such. And people who just pursue short-term pleasure may disregard that because they may think, well, I'll just have more pleasure and more pleasure and more pleasure, except their minds become acclimated to a given level of pleasure. And so they need to raise that level in order to get that, let's say, subjective satisfaction once again. And this is, of course, the root of many addictions. This is the root of many suboptimal behaviors. So thank you, John, for that comment. And we also have a comment and question from our friend Alan Crowley. He says, thank you for the excellent discussion, and thank you, Alan, for your kind support. What does legislation built upon this reasoning look like? So we have, hopefully broadly among transhumanists, a recognition of the importance of autonomy, morphological freedom, but at the same time, we also have this concept of virtues, the concept of taking a longer term orientation, recognizing that changes may happen, but also there are scientifically valid insights, there are evolutionarily valid insights. So putting all of this together, what would you say are some possibilities for legislation that's not essentialist, that embodies all of these ideas?
Yeah, all of these ideas, everything you mentioned, I fully subscribe to. Everything, all of that must play a role. There are some significant cultural differences, which I basically, whenever I teach an introductory ethics class, and I've like most of my students are from the United States, and I do raise one specific question, which shows is an enormous cultural difference between people from the Anglo-American world and people from continental Europe. And that concerns the law, the legal aspect. It's one specific case. And the specific case has to do with shooting down a hijacked plane. So, we've got the case where there's a plane with 100 people on board, and the people the plane was hijacked. And it seems to be the case that the plane flies directly onto a nuclear power plant. And basically, we know that once if it successfully crashes into the nuclear power plant, 1 million, 10 million people will be dead. The entire area will be devastated. for many decades, if not longer. So it is a very serious consequence. Luckily, you, and this is what all my students, each one of you, you're the president of the United States. Luckily, you've got a military plane nearby, and you could command basically the plane to shoot down the hijacked plane, because it seems to fly directly into a nuclear power plant. Would you do so? Should you do so? Is it a moral obligation to do so? What is the response I'm getting? What do you think?
Very interesting questions. So raise your hand if you would absolutely shoot down the plane in those circumstances. Anyone? Art Ramon raised his hand. Okay, raise your hand if you would never shoot down a plane under these circumstances that Stefan described. Interesting. Raise your hand if you would sometimes shoot down the plane, depending on other situations, depending on some context that has been left out. Anyone?
Probably no.
Okay, so interesting. So Art Ramon,
so most people, there's a tendency now to shooting down the plane. Actually, in my class, it's usually 100%. No, if they're all from the United, it's most people. There's hardly anyone who wouldn't shoot down the plane, because basically the consequences are such that you have either 10 million people, 1 million people die in the region will be devastated, or it's just like 100 people being dead. The 100 people on the plane, and it's very likely actually the people on the plane will be dead anyway, even if they don't hit the target of the nuclear power plant. Even if they miss it, it's very likely that they would be dead. Actually, in one case, this has not been the case. It was a case of the shoe bomber, where the passengers in the plane actually got control of the plane, and no one died in the end. Anyway, so and the interesting thing, if I ask this very same question in a class in the where I've got continental European students, the majority, most people would not shoot down the hijacked plane, in particular in German-speaking countries, but also in the rest of continental Europe. And that is very interesting. The response is completely different. And this has to do with the legal situation in these two cultural spheres. In the Anglo-American world, there is utilitarian thinking is a dominant one. And the utilitarian thinking basically goes, you look at the consequences. In the one case, you've got 100 people, very likely 100 people dead, very slow probability, no one's dead. And if it hits the target, then there will be 1 million people dead. And you want to avoid that the 1 million people or 10 million people will die. So So for the most people, that's the right thing to do. That's as good as it gets. That's where you would shoot down the plane. That's utilitarian thinking. And the federal court in the United States has confirmed that this is the right way to respond. That's a legally legitimate way to respond to that issue. The same issue has been addressed by the highest court in Germany, and the highest court, due to obvious as a consequence of things which happened 25 years ago. So, and the highest court in Germany said, if the chancellor made such a decision, that would be a criminal offense. The person could be put into jail. That is not a legitimate decision which the chancellor could make. Why not? Because here, that is a deontological, a Kantian way of thinking. You sacrifice the life of one person whose value is infinite, possesses human dignity, for the value of 10 million people. And each person has the value the value of any person is infinite, based on that Kantian type of reasoning, which is dominant in the continental European world. And so based on a deontological reason, actually it becomes illegal also in these cultural contexts. And that is very interesting. And you wouldn't say sort of the legal structures in continental Europe or in the United States, in both situations, it's not the case that the one is totally immoral and the other, or the totally moral and the other isn't. No, there are two different ways of structuring liberal democracies. We cherish autonomy. We cherish something, scientific insights. We want to try to realize something important, but the underlying structure is the logic of reasoning is different, and that has to do. And the people who've been grown up in the United States, in the Anglo-American world, basically have such a framing that they have a tendency to looking at the overall outcome. And the people who've grown up, who've went to school in the continental European world, they got a completely different framing. And that also has to do with the legal framing in these various areas. The legal framing in the United States, you've got the case law. You look at one specific case, and then you draw inferences, similarities to current cases, and that's where you make that in order to come to a conclusion. In Germany, for example, we've got a different line of reasoning. We've got a deductive reasoning. We've got general laws, and then we subsume the individual case under general laws. And that is so the one is inductive, the other one is deductive. So we've two completely different ways of thinking about these specific issues. And that's when the question of legal structures comes up. And I say, no, look, I mean, we cannot, in continental Europe, we don't want to adapt a utilitarian framing in the same way as you in the United States want to adapt a continental, a deontological framing. It doesn't make sense. We've got a long type of heritage. We've got our roots, and we've grown up in these circumstances, and we need to take them into consideration. And that is very important to take, these situational factors into consideration. And that has to do also with not only, and this is, so the legal structures apply a very general way of thinking about different issues. That's why empiricism is very important in the Anglo-American world, and rationalism has been very important in the continental European world. It is a completely different way of thinking. And the Chinese, again, have an alternative way of thinking. So there was, there's a Chinese social credit system. And in China, with the social credit system, there was a young boy who wanted to go to university, but he passed all the exams, but he was not allowed to enter university. Why was he not allowed to enter university? Because his dad didn't pay back a credit. And, because the dad, someone's closely related, if your friends are criminals, if that has a consequence. You are in part embedded in relational structures. It's a relational ethics. You're part of a relational structures. It doesn't matter whether you've done something, whether you've committed a crime, whether you didn't pay back your credit, your dad didn't do so. And that has consequences on your social credit standing. And this is, if you want to deal with China, then you need to understand the relational structures in particularly into the Eastern Asian religious communities, which still have an impact in our contemporary tech, surveillance, digital structures as they are dominant in China. We have you receive an identity card, you look at it, then you need to acknowledge, if you're sort of in Eastern Asia, you look at it, you acknowledge the importance of the other person, you acknowledge whether he or she's more important, less important, and that concerns how you interact with the other person. And so it is this relational structures, relational ethics is simply their way of doing. We've got a deontological way. Anglo-American structures have a more utilitarian way of dealing with issues. Is the one thing better than the other? Is there an absolute criteria? No, I don't know any. I wouldn't say so. That is non-essentialism. We've got simply different ways of dealing with the specific issues. And that must have consequences for how we structure the issues right now, for how we deal with the issues right now. And that can even refer to some cultural events which have taken place in the various countries. So, for example, I mean, there are issues like male circumcision, culturally widely practiced. In the end, if you think about it, it is a direct harm being done to another person, but it's a strong part of the Jewish culture and the Muslim culture. And so there were discussed, but in principle, if you think about it, if you apply an ethics of autonomy, then really, I mean, it doesn't have any. There is no certain medical advantages associated with male circumcision. There's some, they're not sufficiently well documented, the medical evidence, to actually make it obligatory. It's undecided, at least, the case. And that's why, but if you want to do it for medical reasons, that's a completely different reason than if you want to do it for religious reasons. Um, and then, so actually, if you take ethics of autonomy into consideration, then actually male circumcision is a highly problematic procedure. You really need to think about whether that is not unnecessarily bodily harm being done to another person. And that's why people in Iceland or in Denmark, they've been thinking about rendering it illegal. On the other hand, because it has consequence, it undermines Muslim and Jewish practices, religious practices. And if you considered making it illegal in a country like Germany with a history of the Holocaust, then you simply can't do it. Because that is not the appropriate way to dealing with such an issue in a country in which the Third Reich, the so-called Third Reich, occurred. And that's why we need to, ethical questions, legal questions, they need to take underlying structures into considerations. Do we think relationally utilitarian manner? Do you think in an Ubuntu manner, or do we think in a deontological manner? And it also needs to take our cultural roots into consideration. Maybe we should move into the direction that we should try to avoid the direct harm being done another person. But so far, and what happened with the Holocaust and the Third Reich is so closely related to us. That's why one shouldn't make such a suggestion in a country like Germany, basically. And so that's why that's also essentialism in practice. I'm very hesitant to making general, essential, universally valid statements concerning the law, but on concerning legal ways, moral ways of dealing with specific issues. I'm telling a story, what works, what might work in specific circumstances. But I do uphold something. I currently uphold something, like autonomy. That's a wonderful and morphological freedom. That's great. But even these issues are contingent in the end. If we, let's say in 200 years' time or in 100 years' time, we've got a very sufficiently well-developed AI, which could make better political decisions. I might have to rethink my positions. Maybe then we need to defer, and maybe that's a better decision. So far, I don't see it yet. But that's what I mean also by non-essentialism. And so when it comes to legal terms, do take our heritage, our cultural background into consideration.
Yes, thank you very much, Stefan. And that's a fascinating overview of the cultural differences and how certain questions, including how certain hypothetical situations are approached. And shortly, I'll be interested in hearing Art Ramon's perspective, but my perspective on shooting down the plane, since I have some strong European roots, but I spent most of my life in the United States, would be nuanced. So as a first principle, I would try to avoid shooting down the plane through any means possible, including trying to get the plane to somehow land, hopefully with minimal harm to the passengers, maybe bring it down using some assistance, trying to get the people to parachute from the plane, maybe getting them some sort of support. But actually, if it came to my life personally being endangered by that nuclear power plant explosion and I didn't have any other choice, I would shoot down the plane. But it would be a very different situation if I were up in the air in another aircraft and I could escape. And let's say I didn't know the 10 million people, so none of my loved ones or people I had any specific reason to be especially concerned about were on the ground. If it were just an abstract matter of 100 people on the plane versus 10 million on the ground, but I don't know any of them, I would not be morally comfortable with sacrificing the 100 people for the 10 million. And the reason for that would be I would then be actively responsible for the deaths of the 100 people. Whereas if, again, all of these people are just humans to me, I don't have any special relationship to them. If 10 million people died of some other external cause, of course I would lament that. I would think that's terribly tragic, but I was not an agent in their deaths. Now, if it's, again, self-defense, if it's defending me, if it's defending my family, my friends, I would take that step, and I would take responsibility for the consequences, because it's better to accept whatever consequence there is than to be dead. But if it's just me being some sort of abstract judge of who gets to live and who gets to die, I'm not going to put myself in that situation. So that's my view. It's rather nuanced.
Wonderful. This is exactly also one of the fundamental difference between Kantian thinking and utilitarian. So in the utilitarian manner, it doesn't matter whether you do or you let it occur. What matters is the outcome, and the outcome, 10 million people's lives saved, is better than 100 people's lives saved. And so it doesn't. The distinction between doing and letting occur is morally irrelevant. But for you, it is relevant. And that is something for the Kantian. The Kantians do make that distinction. They do. No, in the one case, it was you who directly killed an innocent person. And you need to see the 100 people on board of the plane, they're innocent people. And you are directly responsible for killing them, basically. If it were to happen, like in the shoe bomber case, they might get, there might even be a slight possibility of them getting control of the plane and they wouldn't have to die. And the Kantian way of phrasing, as long as you're not directly responsible, you let it occur, you are not morally to blame for it.
Yes, thank you, Stefan. And Art Ramon, what would your justification be? Because you raised your hand saying you would shoot down the plane.
Oh, yeah, it's like I put it in the chat, Spock, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. That just seems logical to me. We've got it in the culture. Haven't Europeans seen Star Trek?
Yeah, I disagree with Spock there, but I am an ethical individualist. So Spock has a more collectivist ethics. Now, I like Mr. Spock. No offense meant to Spock, but I do think it is not morally permissible to intercompare the value of individual lives, because if we think death is wrong, as I do, then each person is essentially a distinct moral universe unto him, her, or itself. And the death of one person is like an entire universe being extinguished, and they're different universes. So there's no way to say one person is 12 times better than another or 0.5 times better than another. There's no singular continuum of betterness along which to compare. And so to me, it's not permissible to just decide to take anyone's life. Now, again, if somebody were threatening my life, or if someone were attacking someone, or even inadvertently an unfortunate collateral victim of some action that I have to take to protect my life, like if there's somebody with a grenade launcher in a nearby building, and I also have a grenade launcher, and I know he's going to launch a rocket at me, would I fire my grenade launcher first, knowing it would blow up the building? Yes, I would, because it would be to protect me, or maybe to protect people I'm responsible, morally accountable for. But I'm not going to say that 100 of some people can be sacrificed for any number of other people.
Let's use that same scenario. And let's say this plane, you're the chancellor making the decision to shoot it down or not, but that plane is headed towards you. Not some.
In that case, right,
well, there you
right.
go. It changes. All of a sudden, now you make a different decision because it's going to affect you directly.
It's self-defense in that case.
Exactly.
So it's a question of what do I have the responsibility to defend? And again, that's why I raised my hand and saying sometimes I would shoot down the plane. First, I would try every other possible way to bring it down without harm. And also, it's a difference. Do I have a direct moral responsibility to protect certain people on the ground? If I'm just some person floating up there making the decision, but I'm not the chancellor, I don't have family there, I don't have a special tie to those people, I am not going to shoot down the plane. But if I have a special tie, like if I'm told you are the leader of this nation, you have the responsibility to protect the 10 million people on the ground. And the 100, well, we don't know who they are, but I might make that decision. But I would have to be in that position where I'm responsible for these other people, where it is up to me what happens to them either way. If I'm just me floating up there in the air, then I don't have that special responsibility. So again, a nuanced position, but I get your point regarding the chancellor.
And in Germany, sort of the additional point which comes up is basically, well, what is the value? Do we attribute a specific value to each human being? If we make the statement, well, saving 1 million people is better than saving 100 people, then it means we start attributing value also to human beings. And the Kantian framing, which is very, in a way, has a religious grounding, but it goes along with the understanding, well, there's value is something we attribute to things, to objects. We buy a pet, whether that's a good framing or not, but that's legally valid all over the world, besides in one country. But we buy a pet. That's why we attribute a limited value to a dog, to a cat. But we shouldn't have the right to buy a human being, because a human has dignity, has infinite value. And infinite value means, if you make a calculation, the value of one person is infinite. You couldn't say concerning value, 100 people have less value than 1 million people. Even one person doesn't have less value than 1 million people. If you start with the premise, that one person has infinite value. And this is a completely different phrasing about talking about human beings and the value which goes along with it. And that's dominant. That's even a strong part of the legal constitutions in continental European countries, whereas in a utilitarian framing, there's a higher chance that we attribute, humans simply have a limited value. We're on a limited value. They have more value, than cats and dogs, but in the end, it's still a limited value. And that's a very interesting insight, which has an enormous amount of implications concerning actual decision makings.
Yes, indeed. And of course, the moment one accepts the view that humans have a limited value, there could be some other implications we wouldn't want with that, like social policies which might intentionally curtail somebody's well-being or even the length of a person's life for an ostensible greater good. And I do not think that that kind of moral arithmetic is tenable in the greater scheme of things, so to speak. I think that can lead to some very dangerous consequences. If
we've seen the consequences in the Third Reich in Germany, and that's basically where some human beings were suddenly classified as and not as persons and not deserving that recognition of having dignity. And basically the reaction, the sort of the German reaction towards the Third Reich, we never want to merely treat another person as an object anymore after what had happened then. And this is why there's such a strong, this is how they come to the conclusion, basically, a chancellor who decides to shoot down a plane, a hijacked plane, would basically be doing the same thing. They would treat innocent people as a means, as mere objects, to sacrifice them to save 1 million other people. And that's where, the problematic social dimensions come in. And thanks a lot for stressing sort of the social dimension as well.
Yes, indeed. So now hopefully we will be able to get to some questions from our panel. And let's start with Jennifer Hughes. Jennifer, after the conversation we've had thus far, what are some questions or comments that you would have?
Hi, yeah, Alan actually asked a little bit of my questions because I was going to ask how you would like to see some of these philosophies of yours actually physically implemented into politics. I do know, obviously, with plans with politics, it varies by region. What you're trying to be, what area you're trying to be candidate of, and what issues are going on in that immediate area. But for when I ran, I had a human centered campaign. So anything that was in my platform of proposals for the city had to improve human health or well-being, or it wasn't included. So some of the things that I put in there that may have been kind of something, I guess, I don't know if general is the right word, but that might apply to some of your philosophies, was that I did have proposals in there for legalization of prostitution, legalization of drugs, and then taking the money from the enforcement that's paid for those things and putting it into increasing the health services so that anyone in those professions was taken care of, and anyone that was participating with people in those professions or things like that made sure that everybody was safe, and things like that. Would anything like that be along the lines of what you'd like to see implemented, or any other ideas like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for example, prostitution is legal in Germany. Why is that? Because in the end, it's an activity. It's a skill. It's not the selling of the body. You don't sell it. If you sold the body, then you would have the right to do anything with the body, which is
Yeah.
definitely not the case. No,
Yeah.
you don't have the right to eat the other person when it's prostitution. No, it is an agreement. Person A meets person B. Person A says, I'm offering skill ABC. Person B says, I want skill EFG. Well, if they've got different skills they're not entering into a contract. So it's not only if they agree upon the sort of the request and demand, then they establish a contract, and that's perfectly fine. But once you start working in that profession, then you also need to you need to be covered by medical insurance.
Yeah.
That's as people are in Germany, for example, and social insurance and all that. It's just like in any other job as well.
Right.
And because health is such an important issue, I in particular have my worries. I mean, in the United States, concerning the absence of a universal healthcare system. This is really just terrible. Because in the end, people, you get run over by a car and you think, if I order the ambulance, I might be broke for the rest of my life. I've got cancer. I will never, ever get back on my feet. And this is not something which, that's just a terrible situation. It's not just a lifestyle choice, whether you want to have a health insurance or anything else. And I'm not making, I'm not saying, so healthcare, that's why I referred to sort of the psychological studies early on, where like 80% said if you were healthy and 120, they would want to live longer. That clearly says, no, that's what most people want, firstly. And secondly, it is actually a prereq, even those who don't explicitly want it. In many cases, if they want to fly to Mars, they still need to be healthy, and they don't, whatever else they want to do, it might simply be a prerequisite for doing so. But that doesn't mean, obviously, if there's a possibility, making physicians-assisted suicide, if someone's life is not worthy of living, if someone judges for themselves that their life is not worthy of being lived anymore, then they all should also have the right to basically, contacting an organization, a physician, and asking them to providing them with a specific medicine so that they can drink it and they can commit suicide. That is part of the morphological freedom. But I'm particularly interested in the health insurance issues, because in the end, that has some tax. This has some enormous implications concerning taxes, concerning how we structure the digital system, and so on. And I think sort of the way things are structured in the States, it makes, in the extremely libertarian way, it makes the CEOs of big companies richer and richer. in the system as we have it in China, it makes the political leaders, it's in the interest of the authoritarian governments of the political leaders. But here, unfortunately, the Europeans don't have a better option either because they have the GDPR. They at least have a universal healthcare system, which is great, which is why Europeans from the European Union live 4 to 5 years longer than US Americans, which is already something, which is significant because the American healthcare system is much better than the European one. Because there are many treatments which are being offered there, which are not being offered in Europe. However, but in Europe, there's a problem with the financing. And the financing, I think it has a lot to do. We don't, and that's why I'm sort of also presenting the Euro-Transhumanism. I'm challenging, no, we need to take something on board from the Americans, maybe also learn something from the Chinese. We need to be more open to entrepreneurship, more daring, embrace gene technologies, embrace digital technologies, have like a good AI company here, have an infrastructure so that we don't rely on Huawei in our 5G systems, which is absolutely scary because the Chinese have parts in the German 5G system, and which it probably enables them to get hold of the data, which is what they're interested in anyway. So, and in addition, in Europe, we've got a GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, which, that's why you have to click accept when you come over to the EU. But that makes it enormously difficult to comprehensively collect digital data. But if digital data are so important, we give them to China or the tech leaders anyway, then we should use them. We in Europe should use them, and maybe we should have an institution which collects them in an obligatory manner, and we should use the personalized to collect the data in order to pay for it what we are interested in, what democracy is interested in. And what are we interested in a universal healthcare system, in other social securities, in education, infrastructure, in particular in the healthcare system, but we need money for it. And if we don't collect personalized digital data, I think Europe is just self-destroying, and people are just coming over for pizza, pasta, and watching us dancing as gladiators in front of the Colosseum. And that's the only reason why people might be coming to Europe, and that's not a good. And I'm hoping that we need to learn, and the US also needs to learn, because when it comes to digital data collection, I think the Chinese are doing a better job in certain respect than the United States, because certain better job in a more efficient way, because they basically have the morally obligatory way. They collect all the digital data within China and via Huawei, Alibaba, and TikTok outside of China. So we need this competitive element needs to be taken into consideration. So the financing must never be forgotten. So that's an important part. But I would want to, if you actually implement something, promote the universal healthcare system in the United States, and then the quality of life would be significantly improved for many people.
We have some things here again. So when I ran, it was for mayor. So it would be in charge of the city, not a state or the country. But there are some campaigns for mayors for universal healthcare and things like that. But if you structure it, say, for your city properly, where you're doing things like this, like, again, legalizing prostitution, legalizing drugs, and taking the enforcement and detention funds and reappropriating it to where you're setting your city up to have its own universal healthcare plan, where all of your members of your city or town or wherever are set, then you can at least start to implement those things and do well for your city, and then show that your city is thriving, and then hopefully connect with other mayors and things like that, and trying to make it nationwide. But you have to start somewhere by at least giving your own people that you are responsible for healthcare.
That's a great policy, and I think if you can show it, you can make it work within the city. Then sort of, it's not just like a communist utopia. No, it is actually something. It works without people necessarily getting expropriated.
Yes.
You can still make money, but the people don't have to worry about cancer basically ending up in debt for the rest of their lives. And one has to sort of the tricky issue is always. The tricky issue is about investing the money in new drugs. This is so how to do that best. And here I'm very well aware that the United States is doing actually a very good job, because I mean, there's much more money available. And in Europe, unfortunately, because of the lack of funding, they are not willing to undertake risky research. They usually develop some new drugs for specific issues, and in the United States, we have like so much venture capitalists who basically say, "Oh, let's try things out, even if they sound crazy." And then if they got a breakthrough, something new, that's wonderful. You know, that's a wonderful thing. And I would hope, and I would hope that can be also realized by means of maybe public universities. But we all know sort of public systems are not often are more risk averse. On the other hand, what makes me, more optimistic is, the COVID vaccine in the end BioNTech was developed in the center of Germany, and they were like some scientists of Turkish origin who who had an excellent training education, and they become entrepreneurs in Germany, and they basically made the decisive step. Even though they're brilliant, within like 8 or 9 months they got ready some COVID vaccine. And even though they're brilliant scientists, all over the world. So it seems to even be able to work, that one gets some, if one wants to, and if one puts effort into it, one can even, within a public system, it seems to be possible to getting such a breakthrough as the COVID vaccine clearly demonstrates. So one would have to, fund the universities. I'm not sure whether the major can and how far that's possible decision, or whether that's more for the more regional thing. But this would have to be shown as well, because research in specific, anti-aging treatments and that's important for promoting that kind of that field too.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
Absolutely.
Thank you. And this has been a fascinating conversation on the subject of healthcare. And the U.S. Transhumanist Party did support Jennifer's plan when she ran for mayor of Camden, New Jersey in 2021. So it was a local effort to provide as universal a healthcare accessibility as possible. And I think the issue here is that when a lot of people talk about universal health care, they think of just the central government providing health care that is mandatory for everyone to pay into and participate in, and there are no private alternatives. That's the Canadian model, and it has been, frankly, a disaster, because in Canada there are long queues for essential medical services, and for complex procedures, for cutting edge procedures, the Canadian system denies them to patients, and they come to the United States to receive those procedures. Now, on the other hand, Corshey writes, in regard to life expectancy in the United States, he believes it's lower because Americans love fast cars, firearms, and illegal drugs. What the life expectancy data suggest vis-a-vis the United States versus Europe is that the conditional life expectancy, that is, your remaining expected lifespan if you've attained a particular age, is lower in the United States than in Europe until about the age of 75. So if in the United States you survive to the age of 75, then your remaining life expectancy becomes comparable to that in European countries, because, as you have pointed out, Stefan, the United States does have an advantage in terms of cutting edge medical care, being able to treat and cure diseases more effectively and getting more high-tech care available to people. But a lot of Americans tend to die at younger ages. One, because of the cultural aspects that Corshey mentioned. There is more of a risk-taking culture in terms of physical risk in the United States. That's unfortunate. Another would be the deaths of despair, the opioid overdoses, the deaths from alcohol abuse, from suicides. Those seem to be more common in the United States as well. Another cultural problem, but also may be a response to precarious economic conditions. And then also there could be situations where somebody, for reasons of not being able to afford that healthcare might not be getting healthcare for some preventable condition that could have been addressed. And that's the part where a universal healthcare approach could fill in some of those gaps. Now, it's interesting, David Wallace Croft
Just a
asked,
brief,
sure,
like, I mean, 30 million people not being insured is just a significant number in the United States. So that must have consequences. And even if you're insured, if you can, maybe if you've got a medical precondition, maybe you cannot take out the insurance. And that's why I've had students who came over to Italy to study here because they couldn't get an affordable insurance because with their specific preconditions. And you rightly refer to, well, like a universal healthcare system doesn't have to mean that you can't have a private system. For example, in Germany, there's a mixed system. I live in Italy, where it's different, but in Germany, we've got a mixed system, and sort of you have the possibility to drop out if you make enough money, and then to solely be on a private insurance, and so a mixed system would actually make a lot of sense, and I agree with you in that respect.
Yes, and I think a mixed system is in practice what we would advocate. By the way, since 2010, the Affordable Care Act in the United States does prohibit insurers from denying or excluding coverage based on pre-existing conditions. So technically, according to US federal law, insurers may no longer do that, even though health insurers certainly used to do that before the Affordable Care Act, and that led to the kinds of situations that you described. But there was a question from David Wallace Croft. What does the U.S. Transhumanist Party have to say? What is its stance on universal health care? And we do have our Transhumanist Bill of Rights where we address it. Here's the link to the Transhumanist Bill of Rights version 3.0. It is a nuanced stance, so I'll read Article 7. All sentient entities should be the beneficiaries of a system of universal healthcare. A system of universal healthcare does not necessitate any particular means, policy, framework, source, or method of payment for delivering healthcare. A system of universal healthcare may be provided privately by governments or by some combination thereof, as long as in practice healthcare is abundant, inexpensive, accessible, and effective in curing diseases, healing injuries, and lengthening lifespans. So this is more of a consequentialist definition of universal healthcare. Essentially, we are agnostic as to how to do it as long as the results are achieved. So if it's possible to have a private system where everybody gets affordable, high quality healthcare, then that's the way to go. If that's not possible, if government needs to fill in some of the gaps, for instance, addressing medical emergencies or addressing preventable conditions that are not that expensive to treat for people of lesser means, to fill in that gap that I described and prevent those early deaths, that could be an approach too. If the private system is just a complete mess, maybe there could be a country where health insurers are dysfunctional and a governmental system might be a superior way of providing healthcare in that country. I'm not making a statement about the United States here. I'm making a hypothetical statement. Like, what if there's a country where all private insurance is dysfunctional, there's no good way to pay for medical care, but somebody could set up a government system and start very quickly providing healthcare, then that could be the way to go for that country. So the US Transhumanist Party, in its platform in the Transhumanist Bill of Rights, does not say there's one particular way. It does say we want this consequence of universal availability of healthcare to be desirable and achievable. And Jennifer's approach in Camden, New Jersey, is an example of a local way to work toward that. So maybe there could be some localities or states that create their own programs, and there could be an emergent bottom-up system of universal healthcare as well in those ways. But absolutely, this is an area of conversation worth continuing. And this is where perhaps a Euro-Transhumanist policy framework might have some recommendations that would differ from recommendations that might stem from the American political landscape. Now, I also wanted to make sure Charlie got a chance to ask a question. So Charlie, please go ahead.
First, I want to say thank you, Stefan. Great to see you again, and I always enjoy your discussions. And by the way, everybody should be aware that there's going to be another Beyond Humanism conference coming up this year. Stefan, if you want to give that information later on or put a link to it, like you had last year. You know, I ran for president. I was the nominee for the United States Transhumanist Party, and my platform, I was pushing for the idea of, you know, free universal healthcare and free education and, you know, higher education for everybody and universal basic income. And, you know, there was discussions about whether or not that was considered far left or whatever, which is funny because now, if anybody's paying attention to what Musk has been talking about recently, because they, you know, you Stefan, you brought him up earlier. There was just a very interesting interview with one of my friends, Peter Diamandis, who interviewed him just a couple of weeks ago on their YouTube podcast called Moonshots. And now Musk is talking about universal basic income, and he agrees with it. In fact, he calls it universal high income. And the reason they're doing this now, and this is the reason I was pushing for it, is because, you know, one of the things that we can't ignore in this discussion, especially in this discussion, because we're the Transhumanist Party, is the coming age of abundance. And that's going to change everything, really. I mean, this, you know, the idea that we're going to have the abundance of all of the resources that we want, and that automation is going to bring about robots, which Musk is predicting is going to be in the billions. And it's pretty accurate, actually, if you look at all the different robotic companies that are out there. So there's going to be a transformation in ways that are just unbelievable. And in fact, Diamandis, who's, you know, he spoke at my conference that I held in 2007. And that's where he and Ray Kurzweil first talked about creating the Singularity University, which they did. Diamandis is basically a big proponent of Kurzweil, as am I. But he's changed his idea too about when is the singularity going to happen, because of the way everything's accelerating, the way AI is accelerating. So in that discussion that they had just the other 2 weeks ago, Musk is thinking that we're already in the singularity. You know, that's a little bit of a push. Diamandis has already said that he thinks that Kurzweil's approximation of the singularity happening in 2045 is too far out, because everybody's starting to think it's going to happen a lot sooner because of this acceleration that they're seeing. And this is being prompted by things like ChatGPT and the way it's getting better and better. But they don't even, that's just the superficial version of what's going to happen. But the idea of the abundance economy is coming, and it's coming in pretty soon. And that's going to make it, then we're going to talk about other things that are coming. So when you have not only an abundant economy where, you know, you can have anything you wanted all over at any time, which is what they were proposing, you're also talking about, because of automation and the advancement of computation, we're going to have full immersion virtual reality, full immersion, not just where you see it and hear it, but taste and touch and feel. And then then what? When this discussion started about sex, right? I mean, people are going to start using that full immersion. I mean, let's not pretend that that's not what's going to happen. When the internet happened, the biggest part of the internet was porn. So, you know, these things are all coming very soon. And then you've got on top of that the advent of health, where you're going to have age regeneration, reversal, and people are going to be young again. So the question about whether people that are older can be dating people younger, well, if everybody's healthy again and everybody's 20 years old chronologically or healthy wise, then that's going to change too. So there's a lot of things that are coming that are gonna change, and it's gonna come really soon. So I look forward to having this whole discussion again soon, because the idea of what's right or wrong, or what can or can't be done, is all in flux, and it's going to change dramatically because we're going to be living a lot longer. Is the idea of, you were saying polygamy is good or bad. Well, how do we determine whether or not monogamy is a good idea if we're living 1,000 years? I mean, there's so many things that we have to think about. So I agree mostly with a lot of the things that were brought forward by Stefan, but I do think that there's going to be a huge transformation on so many aspects of what we just talked about, that I would like to see this, because it looks like we're running out of time. So I think we should have another discussion with Stefan and talk about futuristic things coming up, because that's, we're the Transhumanist Party. Let's do that.
It's always wonderful talking to you, Charlie. I hope I'll see you again, by the way, in July, end of June, beginning of July, in Timișoara in Romania. There will be the 16th Beyond Humanism conference in Timișoara. It's on the website beyondhumanism.org. You will find the call for papers, which is still up until the middle of March. Submit your abstracts. We've had wonderful speakers there, and I mean, in the past, and I'm sure we'll have it was great meeting you last year in Paris, and I hope I see you again this year in Timișoara as well. I mean, we've had other speakers from the community. I mean, of course, there was from Natasha Vitamore to Martine Rosblatt. She was there twice already, and many others. We've Anders Sandberg was present, and we've had a really great community of speakers. We've also had engineers, we've had artists, Stella, Eduardo Kach. They were all by Julian Sabolescu. They were all part of that conference series. So beyondhumanism.org, and then you can submit your abstracts. And you're right, now the things are really progressing very fast. You know what? I'm quite surprised. So far, we have sort of the rings which measure our biometric data, and the watches and the smartphone. I'm surprised that not more chips actually move into the inside of our body. We have to have the permanent surveillance of our body system from the inside, and then we can analyze all the data using correlations between digital data and health and capacities. And we do it, and then we can implement, the weak AI systems which we have already, and that would have, we detect if blood pressure goes up, if there's diabetes coming, we can get the measurements before it even causes any problems, and then we can implement measures. We can start a diet, adapt our lifestyle, take drugs. This is the next step. We need to become, RFID chips need to become part of our bodies. And I expect that to happen very soon. I would love to have that, and to have besides the internet of things, I would love to complement it with the internet of bodily things. My entire body being permanently measured by RFID chips and being analyzed by AI. And that would be definitely an extremely useful step for actually realizing some significant forms of preventing diseases and increasing our health span. So, I hope this message this will be realized fairly soon. And do submit your abstracts to the 16th Beyond Humanism conference in Timișoara.
Yes, thank you very much, Stefan. That's beyondhumanism.org. Here is the URL again. This is the website of the Posthuman Studies Hub, and I'll have a question on that following up shortly. But first, I wanted to acknowledge the comment from our friend Didier, who did want you to talk about the subject you discussed just now. Didier Cornell, who is, of course, quite interested in facilitating more sharing of individuals' health data. He said, "Hello, Stefan, you were in the past developing great ideas about longevity and sharing for health data. This could be something to develop in a Euro-Transhumanist view." And I think you did speak about this. So I just wanted to point out this is an area of interest to Didier. Now, I would hope with all of these chips embedded in our organism, any other tracker type of technology, that we would still own our data as individuals, and we would get to decide what to do with it. So we would decide if we want to share the information, contribute it to scientific research, contribute it to medical organizations that would use it to help patients manage or cure or prevent their diseases, we would be able to do that, but we would have the authority to decide as individuals where it goes. So if we don't want it to go to third-party data brokers who would sell the data to health insurance companies that could raise our premiums, or that would publish the data online and blackmail us with it. Oh, your friends will know that you have this health condition unless you pay us money. So we wouldn't want those kinds of uses. And I think the individual autonomy, again, that freedom to decide, that is the key concept here. Would you agree?
And this is one of the things where I strongly need to disagree with you, actually. And this would be sort of a topic of much further discussion, because I think once we have, because you raise the issue sort of then increasing the cost of the insurance system if things go wrong. No, but if we have got a universal healthcare system, this wouldn't have to be the case. There would have to be capped. And in addition, if like everyone's if things are such, if things are arranged that basically our digital data get collected and analyzed, get collected by a political institution, and that's our means for paying for the universal healthcare system, then basically, there shouldn't be the dropout option. We would have to be legally enforced to basically share our personalized health data as a way of paying taxes, as a way of paying for our universal healthcare system. But in that case, such a system would have to be in place. And of course, there are many problematic political issues related to that. I'm in the current system. I wouldn't want to share that. I understand. I wouldn't want to share those issues, but we need to make sure that humans don't have sufficient access to this data. For example, we need to have them primarily being accessed and by algorithms, so that it's like humans will always abuse and use them against someone. But if we take it as a way of paying taxes, then that would be an enormously helpful way. Then the money from our digital data wouldn't make the CEOs of big tech companies richer, or wouldn't promote the authoritarian rule of political Chinese leaders, but it would actually promote the quality of a universal healthcare system. And if everyone provided the data, then at the same time, our research in the field would become better if there was not such a dropout option. And I've got several other arguments in favor of that, but this is one of the elements where I would have to disagree with you. And I understand your position, but I think if there's a general shift, I think we would have to see our basically as a way of paying taxes, of providing basically financing this universal healthcare system.
Yes, this is, I think, a key difference, and I think it stems from different understandings of privacy as well, including between the United States and Europe. So in the United States, a major component of privacy is privacy from the government, or privacy from large institutions as well. And for a lot of Americans now, large corporations are beginning to be seen with a similar level of concern as governments when it comes to coercing individuals or imposing actions or consequences upon individuals that those individuals consider illegitimate. Whereas in a European context, I think you would agree that that kind of disclosure of data for the commercial gain of large corporations would largely at least be inappropriate, but you would be less concerned about it within a political system that's overseen by representatives of the people.
No, we've got that's why we've got GDPR. We've got extremely strong privacy laws. I mean, for example, in Germany, someone received the COVID vaccine 60 times because he was able to do so. Because for privacy reasons, there is no universal system in which basically his vaccines, they're covered by the universal healthcare system, and no one saves the data for privacy reasons. So he was able to get 60 shots of the vaccine, which is, and no, privacy is extremely important. But the reason why I would suggest an alternative way of dealing is firstly, in order, if we actually want to deal with even the rare diseases, the more comprehensive our information is, the better it is. It promotes the quality of the research. And secondly, the more data we have, the more people so it promotes the quality of the research, and that would be undermined if people had the dropout option. It's basically, the rich dropping out, or some people who can afford that, but that undermines again. We need comprehensive digital health data, and the Chinese are better in getting them than in the United States. In the United States, it depends on, because of the privacy thing, on the autonomous decision. That's why I don't think it's such an efficient way to deal with it. To actually being prepared for the future, such a comprehensive data collection would be necessary. And the more data we have, the more reliable the data gets. And as a consequence, we can sell the data better, we can make more money. And as a consequence, we've got more money to increase the quality of our universal healthcare system. That's a very short version of something which I will spell out in more detail, which I spelled out in the We've Always Been Cyborgs book, and even more detail also in the Euro-Transhumanism book. But that's something I'm extremely interested in, anti-aging and increasing health span. And I co-authored a book, for example, with Bernd Klein-Gunk, who's the president of the German Anti-Aging Society. He's co-organizing the biggest anti-aging and plastic surgery annual event, which takes place in Monaco, Monte Carlo, with like 18,000 practitioners participating every year. And he was right now with Ilya. They were now in Davos as well. He was now in Davos in order to bring it to, stressing the relevance of increasing the health span to the world leaders. And that's a wonderful thing. And Bernd and I, we co-authored a book which was published in German with Penguin Random House. So it was a proper public outreach book, which was already translated in South Korea and other. And so, this is something which is very close to my heart, and sort of the way I'm suggesting. Didier is doing a great job in that field too, and we need to get together in order to develop some proper policy making in order to promote that kind of research.
Yes, and I think this would be a great subject for another in-depth conversation. For now on this subject, I will share the Virtual Enlightenment Salon that we held with Didier Cornell on big data, AI, and longevity in 2021, where Didier also provided his proposals. Now, one of his proposals with regard to any, let's say, mandatory sharing of health information is that it would be anonymized so that institutions would not know which individual it came from. And I think the reason for that, and of course, I would support that kind of safeguard, would be to prevent adverse consequences being taken by the system against the individual for having a health condition. And let's suppose it is the kind of system where there is universal health care, where there is at least a general level of concern about applying that information wisely. But let's say there's an individual within that system, hypothetically, he's 75 years old, he feels like he's still in sufficiently good health to work, but he has diabetes and high blood pressure, and he thinks, well, he still has enough value to contribute. Maybe he's a civil servant in some position of responsibility. Maybe he's the CEO of a company. He doesn't want to let go. He doesn't want to just become a patient. He wants to continue to work. But in the system, his information is disclosed. And so the government would know, his employers would know that he has diabetes and high blood pressure, and they might have a different opinion. They might think, well, look, you're 75 years old, you have these health conditions, it's time for you to take a step back. And for that person, that may be a terrible blow, because that work or that position or that level of responsibility might be what keeps him going, might be what prevents him from lapsing into a state that's more dependent, that's less healthy if he loses his sense of purpose. So that's an area where I would be worried, and that's just one of numerous possible examples, but that's an area where I would be worried if the institution knows that the data came from you, the specific individual, rather than just having some anonymized ID associated with the data, that could lead to some unintended consequences.
Imagine, however, how relevant the interconnections between environmental influences, lifestyle, and so on, in order to really follow up the entire range of implications it has, how genes, how work, how stress, how personal life, how environmental influence actually have consequences for which diseases you get, the quality of life. That's why I think it is extremely important to have that personalized over time, over the lifetime. And this would generate so much more information, which is absolutely fundamental for anti-aging research. And that's why I would take a different stance on that issue, being fully aware of the challenges you mentioned, obviously.
Yes, thank you, Stefan, for that answer. And we're going to start bringing this discussion to a conclusion. We have a little bit more flexibility today. I'm hoping to give Art Ramon the chance to ask a question, and then I will ask a question that hopefully will try to bring all of these threads together. But Art Ramon, please go ahead.
Yeah, here in the States, there's a lot of talk of reduced fertility. And here there's a lot of problems with, women choosing to bear, a lot of conflict between the sexes. Guys or passport bros going to different countries to find women. And some people who are the red pillars who just say the hell with women. Is that a thing in Europe, or is that just like an American thing?
I think so. Rape culture, hookup culture is pretty big now, and sort of in the United States. I mean, I've got a sense of both. I teach as an American institution, so I get a sense of what's going on in the United States, and mostly living in Central Europe. I still see differences actually concerning the attitude towards sex. But America is such a big country. That's why it's so difficult. I think sort of it does make a difference. We've got like many mid-states students coming from a more conservative background, or Notre Dame students. But then there are also like people coming from California, and really California and sort of that tech culture seems to be particularly hedonistic. And this is. We don't have that so much actually in Europe. But then you get to see, then you get to Berghain in Berlin, the Temple of Dionysus, where anything you will see things you could see probably no other club in the world. So, but that's Berghain, that's one, or Kit Kat, these two clubs in Berlin. But otherwise, sort of the lift culture is a very different one. From the United States, and we would have to look at and when making such statements, I would say, it does apply that sort of this on a general level, there is something more imminent, utilitarian, and there is a different because of the underlying ethical systems. However, one also needs to take local or like very specific local situations in consideration, or whether it's Ohio or whether it is California. So, but I can see from what I hear from my students in particular, I've got many advisees who tell me stuff and so on, and so I know it is a different culture in many parts of the United States. There's much more of in certain respects, more of an more of an specific, like the spring break. That's a very hedonist enterprise. There you let go of all your worries. Otherwise, you act differently. We don't have that spring break culture. We have it, as in our university, but like at normal institutions in Europe, you wouldn't have that culture. That's not something which like students in our universities would normally do. We are the American university, but in regular non-American universities in Europe, such a thing doesn't occur. So there are
Now,
some differences.
what about economic? I mean, I hear a lot that say younger generations just can't afford to have children. Is that the same in Europe for their population decline, or the birth rate decline?
The birth rate decline is enormous. We've got a reproductive rate in Germany of 1.5, in Austria is 1.4, in Italy is 1.2. It's terrible. We've got people working in Poland. I know, regular in Poland, they work 3 jobs and just to get by to be able to afford housing. So that's currently sort of in the past 5 years. In the beginning was COVID, then the various wars which happen, and now the various conflicts. That has caused, young people are really are extremely overwhelmed and worried, and I can see that. I think that's very similar actually to the United States, and that leads to that people tending towards some certain extremes, and that division is, as we can see, is extremely strong in the United States. It is not yet so strong in Central Europe, but if we don't do anything about it, we're moving into that direction. And that political division towards the extremes, in the end, they will lead to civil war, and that is what it's not good for a society, and that's why that's one of the things I care about immensely, and I'm extremely scared about. And I do, in particular, the clash gets identified sort of if both things, they've got the only right thing to answer. That's sort of the basis for my critique of essentialism. So we need to talk, we need to find common ground and acknowledge the relevance of the other, put ourselves into the eyes of the others, if you don't share them, but at least make you understand the arguments they're using, and finding a way to peacefully live together, because it's not we're really in times which are particularly overwhelming for young people. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. And this actually helps to bring the discussion around to my question and attempting to unite all of these threads, because you mentioned this increasing conflict between the extremes, this increasing polarization is not good for anybody. And I've also observed before that it seems to me a lot of the people of the American left are like the disaffected children of the people on the American right. Essentially, they're operating within the same framework, but they're rebelling against it by trying to be the exact opposite and amplifying those extremes. Also, the spring break culture that you mentioned, the idea that in the United States, a lot of the time, people have to operate within these very rigid institutions, like American corporate norms are very rigid. And or say in American schools, it's more often that they're very rules-based rather than principles-based. And when people get a break from that, they let go. And I don't do that because I'm not really of the same culture. I've always been astonished by how a lot of people in the United States tended to do that. But it's this idea that there's one extreme that's so rigid it's unsustainable. And so people, whenever they get an official break from that extreme, tend to go way in the other direction. But if they like being way in the other direction too much, they start making that a part of their identity and kind of clashing with the rigid other extreme. And that may be driving the polarization. So the first part of my question is, how do you think that can be overcome, particularly in the American cultural context, because America is still a global hegemon, and what happens in the United States, for better or for worse, gets essentially reverberated throughout the rest of the world, including in Europe, but in other parts of the world as well. But also, I'm wondering how that relates to the distinction, in your view, between transhumanism and posthumanism, because some people were asking, for instance, Alan or Daniel Tweed, whether you're using the term posthuman as a superset or subset of transhuman. And my understanding is it's neither, because you characterize this critical posthumanism as being very much a hard left type of discipline that Euro-Transhumanism disagrees with quite strongly in various respects, including the cancel culture aspects, or the aspects that people can't fully make autonomous decisions if they're in a certain position, like there's an age gap or a financial gap. So in terms of what Euro-Transhumanism can offer that would transcend or overcome what I think is a kind of reflexive left-wing reaction, a reaction against the reactionaries, if you would, that the critical posthumanism and other left-wing strains in the United States espouse. I'd be curious as to your thoughts and what some potential solutions might be.
Yeah, that was a wonderful summary, actually, of what I'm what I've had in mind and what I was trying to present. Yes, firstly, the comment, posthumanism, critical posthumanism is a specific stance, particularly shared, in general, a stance from the left, widely embraced at universities. There are some radical posthumanists who even say they would propose a line of reasoning like, look, global warming is the greatest danger. Humans are the driving factor of global warming. As a consequence, we have a moral obligation not to give birth to anyone. Antinatalism. We humans are the cancer of the earth. That's the most radical stance in that perspective, and I don't even engage with people who present such lines of reasoning, because they're really absurd. And some people have basically I was at a keynote with people from that field where they were keynote as well, and they would tell me, oh, look, here's the rich white man who needs to die out first. This was their way of greeting me. And I'm just, and that's exactly the same type of extremism. And while I do acknowledge, racial discrimination, structural issues, and sexism and speech, and I think I do acknowledge that, and I think any type of illegitimate discrimination is problematic. We need to deal with it. But despite that, just by being critical of their approach, and I'm already the evil white man from Europe, no? And this is exactly the same kind, this polarity. They claim to have the truth, and then the former understanding of the religious fundamentalist tradition, they claim to have the truth. And this, this discrimination based on claiming any type of truth is, we need to lighten the truth. No, that is the goal. We need to make people realize, no, neither you nor anyone else, I will argue against you no matter what you stand for. And any position has strong challenges, weaknesses you can't deal with. Once you realize that the conflicts and the polarities come about on the basis of you claiming that you've got a fundamental insight, a truth which the others don't have, that turns the others into monsters. And no matter whether you come from the left perspective of the monsters, or you come from the perspective of a fundamental religious fundamentalist, it's always the others who are the monsters whom you need to be targeted. And so the goal is, for me, I'm trying to show now, we need to move away from truth. We need to move from any objective fundamentalist way of truth. As I explained before, of course I subscribe to scientific truths. That's not but but they're not, that's a they don't even can't claim, they are context dependent, even they are. But once you start, in particular with moral truths, and you're saying, these are valid forever and at all times, then that will lead to conflict. And we need to undermine, we need to show that this is that any of their approaches has leads to the same kind of structural violence which they accuse their opponent of. And that only happens as a part of the reform education system. You enter into the dialogue, and I let myself get confronted, and I stand up for that, and I'm aware of how people actually attack me from it in universities who do have that type of extreme approach. And I'm showing, but you always need to stay calm, and be aware, understand, what you're dealing with, and show that the violence which they accuse others of actually goes along with such an attitude. And so I think the problem is related to anyone having such fundamental truth drum. Be open to what the other says, even if it's not always easy. It can be very difficult, in particular when it concerns like very fundamental issues. Like fundamental issues, what counts as a life worthy of living? No, embryo, fetus, beginning of life. But if there's like a significant amount of people who shares a different understanding, living in a liberal democracy, we need to respect the other. We need to allow the others. We must stop the violence, because in the end, why should you know better than anyone else? As if like there was some Holy Spirit which entered only your minds, but not that of others. And that is a long part of a long process. So understanding the challenges which go along with truth. And the other factor was the economic factor. That is also, when people are financially well off, they have, that's not always the case, but normally once people are afraid of losing a crown, of not having a future, then they look for a scapegoat. And the scapegoat are the others, the refugees, the immigrants, the weak people in general, the monsters. And whenever you're uncertain of yourself, these are the ones who you blame. And the worse your economic system is, the tension will get stronger, and it will also concern the middle class. And such a system will end up in a civil war, and none of us wants to end up there. So the economic factor, no matter what sort of the intellectual reflections say, the economic factor always needs to be taken into consideration. Even though intellectually you affirm something, if it cannot be financed, it cannot be financed. You need to make sure, we all, for a certain type of lifestyle, we all need to have a certain financial grounding. And that's something which many people have good ideas on how to divide up the money from the rich, but they don't know where the money comes from. They mustn't forget that the money needs to be earned first. And that's something which, unfortunately, in many ideological, many academic circles, is unfortunately too widely shared, because they've never had experience on how difficult it is to get the money to make money. And so the economic factor is one, and relativizing, understanding that we all have contingent perspectives. These are the two elements which I would take care of most in order to undermine sort of the increasing polarities which we're currently facing with.
Yes, thank you very much, Stefan, for that answer. Thorough and nuanced as always. And I will point out, you mentioned lightening the truth. Perhaps that's another sense of enlightenment and the value of the discussions that we have here at the Virtual Enlightenment Salons, essentially extending that spirit of the original 18th century Age of Enlightenment as a time of great philosophical discussions where a lot of previously held truths were challenged and debated, and different people provided different perspectives and tried to reason through issues which were previously just accepted on faith or taken as dogma, or believed to be unchallengeable. And I do agree with you strongly in this respect. Whenever there emerges a kind of intellectual orthodoxy on the right or on the left, or of any persuasion that states these ideas may not be challenged, they may not be discussed, they just have to be accepted as part of whatever intellectual package is being offered, that becomes very dangerous because people's freedoms get restricted, people get demonized, they become otherized, they become persecuted ultimately. And that feeds into the polarization, that feeds into the likelihood of civil war. And I would say, first of all, thank you very much for joining us. This turned out to be an extremely thorough and far-reaching conversation where we had all of these threads from different realms of human life and activity, and we were able to extend them in parallel, weave them together. But this is, of course, always an ongoing discussion. So hopefully we will have many more to come. And for those who have stayed with us, thank you so much. We will continue holding our virtual enlightenment salons, offering this caliber of discourse so that we may all live long and prosper.